Welcome to Cosmic Wand. Today's adventure, Dumbledore sealed Harry's magic to save Voldemort, but at age 11 the seal broke backwards. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The seal fails. The great hall smelled of candles, smoke, and rain-wet stone, and Harry Potter stood at the end of a line of children he did not know, trying to make himself smaller than he already was. He had spent 10 years learning how to do this. A boy in an oversized jumper, shoulders rounded, eyes down, taking up as little of the world as he could manage. It had kept him alive in the cupboard under the stairs. It kept Dudley's friends from noticing him in the corridors at school. Tonight it kept 400 strangers from looking too hard at the famous scar on his forehead, which was the only famous thing about him, and which he had learned only a month ago belonged to a story he had never been told. The hat sat on its stool at the front of the hall, ancient and creased, and one by one the children went up and put it on their heads and were sorted into the 4 long tables. Harry watched the ritual without really seeing it. He was hungry in the specific hollow way he had been hungry his whole life, and he was tired, and somewhere under the tiredness a thin wire of fear ran taut because he did not understand this place, and he had learned long ago that not understanding a place was dangerous. "Potter, Harry," said the stern witch with the scroll, and the hall made a sound like a held breath letting go. Whispers ran along the tables. He felt them on his skin. That's him, the scar. "Did you see?" He walked the length of the dais with his eyes on the worn stone, climbed the stool, and the witch lowered the hat onto his head, and the brim slid down over his eyes, and the hall went dark and merciful and silent. For one heartbeat there was nothing but the smell of old felt in the dark under the brim. Then something reached into him. It came as a pressure first, a presence leaning against the inside of his skull, and a voice that was not a voice, dry and amused and very old, beginning the way it must have begun for every child for 1,000 years. "Well now, difficult, very difficult, plenty of courage, I see. Not a bad mind either, and a thirst to prove yourself." The voice stopped. Harry felt it stop the way you feel a hand freeze on your shoulder. The presence in his head had moved casually, the way it had surely moved through 1,000 children, and it had touched something behind his eyes, and now it had gone perfectly still. "What," said the hat, and all the amusement had drained out of it, "has been done to you?" It was not a question. Harry did not know what to say. He did not know what the hat was talking about. He sat in the dark under the brim with his hands folded in his lap and his heart beating in his throat, and he understood only that something was wrong, and that wrong things had always been his fault. "Be still," the hat said, lower now, urgent. "Boy, whatever happens, hold still. I have sorted children since the Founder's breath. I have never seen a working like this in a living skull." Someone built it, searched, and he felt it search, felt the foreign attention sweeping the architecture of his own mind like a lantern carried through a house he had never been allowed to enter, a cage. "Around your magic, and around something else. And the lock is," the hat pressed. It did not mean to. Harry understood that much after. The hat was old and curious, and it leaned, just slightly, the way anyone leans toward a thing they cannot make sense of, and its ancient attention settled for one instant against the seam of the lock that had been set into him before he could speak. And the lock, which had held for 10 years, which had been tuned and balanced and tested by a hand far more careful than the hat's, met an outside touch for the first time since it was made, and it failed. It did not open. It broke, and it broke the wrong way. Later, when Harry had the words for it, he would say that it was like standing at the bottom of a dry riverbed in the dark, a riverbed he had walked his whole life and believed was simply the shape of the ground, and feeling from very far upstream the first tremor of water that had been dammed for a decade coming back down to find its bed. It came as light, not light the eyes could see. Light underneath that, light in the place where his own thoughts lived, and it came not as a trickle but as a wall 10 years high. The cage shattered outward, and through the broken lattice of it came everything that had been kept out of him since he was 15 months old, all of it, all at once, a flood with no front and no end, pouring up out of the broken dam and into the boy who had been built to hold none of it. Power. It had a structure. That was the thing that undid him. In the half-second he had to feel it before discipline closed over the feeling like a fist. He had always thought of magic in the month since he had learned the word, as a thing wizards did, a trick of wands and words. This was not that. This was a country. Vast lit terraces of it climbing away inside him into a dark that had no ceiling, galleries and vaults and burning rivers of the stuff, a cathedral with no walls assembling itself in the space where for 10 years there had been a locked and empty room. It rose through him level by level, and each level woke as the flood reached it and lit, and he understood with a horror that had no bottom that all of this was his, that it had always been his, that it had been standing dark and waiting behind a wall someone had built across the only door. And braided through the flood, thin and silver and snapping as the water hit them, were the threads. He felt those too. He would not understand them for hours. But he felt them go, a fine net of filaments laced all through the cage, running out of him and away, and as the pressure came up the net pulled tight and then tore, strand by strand, each parting with a small bright pain like a hair pulled from the root. dozens of them, 100, a webbing of control he had never known, was there shearing apart under the weight of his own returning magic. Something that had been holding the reins let go all at once because the horse had become the sea. Harry sat on the stool under the sorting hat with the entire great hall watching, and did not move. That was the only thing he did. It was the most important thing he had ever done, and he did it on pure animal instinct, the instinct of a boy who had spent 10 years learning that the safest response to overwhelming force was to give it nothing to see. His face did not change. His hands stayed folded. Flood roared up the galleries of him, and lit a cathedral the size of a country, and tore 100 silver threads out by the root, and on the outside a small dark-haired boy sat very still under an old hat with his lips slightly parted, the way a nervous 11-year-old might sit while the hat made up its mind. Inside, in the lit and roaring vaults, a colder thing was already moving. It moved the moment the first thread snapped, and it moved like a thought that had been waiting a long time to be thinkable. Threads, it said in his own voice, the voice he used when no one could hear him. Something was holding threads, threads run to a hand, whose hand, he did not answer it yet. There was no time, and there was too much happening, the country still lighting inside him level by burning level. But the question was set now, driven in like a nail, and it would not come out again. And then, deeper than the flood, deeper than the lit vaults, in a small, hot room at the back of everything, something else opened its eyes. The cold came off it like breath off ice. Where the flood was vast and bright in his, this was small and dense and not his, a knot of something curled in the oldest dark of him. And when the magic came roaring up through the broken cage, it touched this knot, and the knot stirred and uncoiled the first inch of itself, and tasted the open air for the first time in a decade. Mine, the knot said. It did not say it in words, it said it in appetite. A pressure against the scar on his forehead, hot and old and patient, a thing that had been kept asleep and was no longer asleep, that recognized the flood not as a violation but as a homecoming, that turned toward the new ocean of power inside the boy and reached for it with a hunger that had no bottom and no mercy and no name he had ever been taught. Harry's discipline, which had held against the flood, very nearly broke against this. The flood was his, and he could be afraid of it later. This was a passenger. This was a thing inside his own skull that had wanted while he slept, that was waking now because the wall had come down. Every nerve in him screamed to flinch, to claw at his own forehead, to throw the hat off and run. He held still. He held still because the 400 people watching could not see the flood and could not see the knot and could only see a boy under a hat. And if the boy threw the hat off and screamed, 400 people would learn that something had happened to Harry Potter on the sorting stool. And Harry Potter had survived 11 years precisely by making sure that as few people as possible ever learned anything about him at all. So he reached down into the hot small room himself with nothing but will, and he set his attention against the uncoiling thing the way you set your weight against a door, and he held it. It pushed. He held. It was strong, and it was old, and it was very near the seat of him, and for a long moment that the hall experienced as ordinary silence, the boy and the passenger pressed against each other in the dark, and neither gave. Not yet, Harry told it, not knowing what it was, knowing only that it was the enemy in a way the flood was not. Not now, you stay where you are. And the knot, perhaps because the flood was still rising and it was drunk on it, perhaps because it was not yet whole enough to fight, perhaps for reasons Harry would spend months learning, the knot subsided. It did not leave. It coiled back down into the hot dark and lay there, watching with him now, a cold second presence behind his eyes that had not been there 10 seconds ago and would never be wholly gone again. In the world, perhaps 4 seconds had passed. Boy, said the hat, and its dry old voice was shaking. Boy, can you hear me? Do you understand what just happened on my brim? No, Harry thought very clearly, very calmly, the calm of a person standing in a burning house who has decided that panic is a luxury for afterward. But you do, tell me. The hat was silent for a moment, and in that moment Harry felt it doing something he had not expected. It was deciding. 1,000 years of sorting children, and it sat on his head and weighed something, and what it weighed was him. I am bound to sort and to keep the school's counsel, the hat said at last, slowly. I have kept secrets for headmasters since the school had a roof. I should put this in the hands of whose hand held the threads, Harry asked it. The hat stopped. You felt those, it said. I felt them tear. They ran out of me to somewhere. They were holding me, holding the cage. You said someone built the cage. The same hand built the threads. The words came out of the cold lit place inside him, level and patient, and they did not sound like an 11-year-old, and the hat heard that they did not. I am not asking you to break your oath. I am asking you a question, and I think you are old enough to know the difference between answering a question and betraying a trust. Whose hand? The hall was beginning to murmur. He had been on the stool too long. He felt the stern witch shift beside him, felt the pressure of 400 stares thicken from curiosity toward concern. The hat made its decision. I will tell you nothing of who, it said, fast and low. I cannot. The cost is more than you know, and the danger to you is more than you can imagine. Here, tonight, 11 years old with your power, not an hour returned to you, and it hesitated, and he felt it look at the knot, felt its ancient revulsion, and a thing in your scar that I will not name even to myself in this hall. But I will tell you this because you have earned one true thing tonight and because you will need it to live. You are not protected. Do you understand me? Whatever you have been told, whatever you will be told, however gentle the face that tells it, you are not a child being kept safe. You are a thing being kept useful. The cage, the threads, the hunger behind your eyes. Someone built all three and called it mercy. Now stop asking me questions before they take me off your head and start asking yourself a better one. Who profits from a weapon that believes it is a boy? The cold lit place inside Harry took that in and turned it over and set it down beside the nail already driven and did not so much as twitch. Where do you put a weapon that believes it is a boy, he thought back, to keep it safe and weak and watched, to keep it where it can be steered. Yes, the hat breath, that is the better question. Now. I have to sort you and I have to do it in the next 3 seconds, and you will not thank me for what I choose, but it is the right one, because the lions are loud and brave and they will hide a quiet boy better than the snakes ever could, and because the man who put the cage in your skull will rest easiest if you go where he expects. It paused. Hide in plain sight, Harry Potter, be exactly the boy he built. And when you are ready, and you are not ready, not for years, burn the whole arrangement down. Then it lifted its voice to fill the hall, and it shouted, in the bright public bellow it had used 1,000 times, with not one tremor of what had passed beneath. Gryffindor, the table on the left erupted. Harry came up off the stool into a wall of noise, clapping, cheering, a pair of red-haired twins chanting his name, hands reaching to pull him toward the bench, and he let his face do what a happy, dazed, relieved 11-year-old's face would do. He smiled. He ducked his head. He went where the hands pulled him, down the long table into the warmth and the candlelight, and someone clapped his shoulder and someone else shoved a space open on the bench, and he sat among the lions with his heart going like a hammer and a cathedral burning quietly inside him and a cold thing watching from behind his eyes, and he smiled at every single one of them because that was the work now. That was the only work, to be the boy they expected, while he was very privately something else entirely. He let himself look up the hall once the way a curious child would. Up at the high table the staff sat in a row beneath the floating candles, and Harry's gaze went down the line of them the way a boy's gaze goes anywhere idly, and he was careful to keep it idle, careful to let it skip and wander and not to land. A vast man with a wild beard beaming. A sour, hook-nosed man in black who was already looking at Harry with an expression that did not belong on the face of a stranger, too much in it, too old a grievance, and Harry let his own eyes slide past without catching, noted, moved on. A thin, nervous man in a purple turban whose head was turned slightly away, and as Harry's glance crossed him the scar on his forehead lit with a needle of pure white pain, there and gone in an instant, and the cold knot behind his eyes stirred, recognized, reached, Harry put it down. He put it down without breaking the idle wander of his gaze, without a flinch the cold man in black could have caught, and he let his eyes travel on as if nothing at all had crossed them. But the cold lit place inside him had a second nail now. The turban hurts the scar. The scar holds the passenger. The passenger reached for the turban like a thing reaching for its own. He did not know what it meant. He set it down beside the others and kept walking his gaze along the table. And at the center of the high table, beneath the tallest chair, sat an old man with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles and robes the color of a kingfisher, and the old man was looking at Harry. Everyone at the high table was looking at Harry. He was the boy who lived, and he had just been sorted, and a hall full of children had screamed his name. But the old man's looking was not like the others. The others looked the way you look at a famous thing. The old man looked the way a man looks at a clock he has wound every day for 10 years to check that it is keeping time. There was warmth in the look. Harry could see the warmth from 40 feet away. It was a practiced, genuine, grandfatherly warmth, and it was the most dangerous thing he had seen all night, because the cold-lit place inside him understood at once that the warmth and the checking were the same act, that the old man could feel kindly toward the clock and still be checking that it kept time, that those had never been in conflict for him and never would be. Hello, Harry thought, watching the old man over the rim of a goblet he had picked up to have something to do with his hands. I don't know your name yet, but your hand held the threads. I'd put my whole returned country on it. You built the cage and you built the leash and you have been winding me every day for 10 years, and tonight at 32 minutes past the hour your clock came off the wall in your hands and you don't know it yet. The old man's eyes held his for a moment across the candlelit hall, and Harry made the boy's face do the right thing. He made it widen very slightly with the shy pleased awe of a neglected child who has just been smiled at by the most important man in the room. He ducked his head again. He looked away first because that was what the boy would do, and he let the old man keep the small warm victory of having been the one looked away from. Down the table the food appeared all at once, gold platters heaped with more food than Harry had ever seen in one place in his life, and the lions fell on it, and Harry, who was genuinely, ravenously hungry, whose hunger was real in a way, almost nothing else about him at this table let himself eat. He ate the way the boy would eat, with a kind of careful disbelief, taking too little and then a little more, and the ginger-haired boy beside him with the smudge on his nose talked at him cheerfully through a mouthful of chicken, and Harry said the right small things back, yeah, and brilliant. And I didn't know either, and banked the boy's name, Ron, and Ron's open, friendly, nothing-to-hide face, and let himself be glad of it in a corner of himself he kept walled off from the work. Because the boy needed to be glad of something, and Ron cost him nothing. Up and down the table the older lions made their introductions, and Harry let them sort themselves into his map. A tall, thin boy with a prefect's badge and an air of being personally responsible for the proper functioning of the universe, Percy, Ron's brother, useful precisely because his appetite for rules made him predictable. The red-haired twins who had chanted Harry's name, identical and quick, and already Harry could see, the two people in the house most likely to notice a thing that did not fit. He marked them as a hazard and a resource both, because mischief-makers watch the world the way operators did, for the seams in it, and a boy hiding a seam learns fast to befriend the people who hunt seams for sport. He gave the twins his best dazzled grin and let them adopt him as a project, because a boy the twins liked was a boy the twins would never suspect. He read the rest of the table the way he read everything in glances, between bites. A sandy boy named Finnegan who talked with his hands, a dark, quiet one, Thomas, who watched more than he spoke and would bear watching back. And further down, the bushy-haired girl, already correcting someone's pronunciation of a spell with the bright, relentless certainty Harry would come to know, and beside Harry, hovering, the round-faced boy from the sorting whose toad had got loose again, apologizing to no one in particular for the trouble he was sure he was about to cause. Harry caught the toad without seeming to try as it made for the gravy and handed it back, and the round-faced boy looked at him as though he had pulled the moon down, and Harry understood that kindness was a currency almost no one at this table had ever spent on Neville Longbottom, and that it would buy in time a loyalty worth more than cleverness. None of them knew that was the thing he held on to, eating his first true meal in the warm and the noise. Not one of these bright, loud, ordinary children had the faintest idea that the boy passing the bread had woken 3/4 of an hour ago to a country of fire, and a cold thing behind his eyes, and the certainty that the kindest man in the room had built his whole life as a trap. They saw the famous scar and the small, grateful boy and nothing under it, and that was exactly as it had to be, and Harry let the not knowing of 400 people settle over him like the first real shelter he had ever been given. He had spent 11 years being seen too much, watched and reported and managed. To sit in a crowd that saw only the mask was, he found, almost restful. Once, far up at the high table, the hook-nosed man in black leaned to say something to the man in the purple turban, and the turbaned man flinched and went pale and turned his face away, and Harry, catching it over the rim of his goblet, marked the small wrongness of it without knowing yet what it meant. That the watcher and the door had business with each other, that the cold man in black was already suspicious of the nervous man in the turban, and that whatever was wrong in this castle, Harry was not the only one who had noticed something was. He set it on the board unread beside the rest and went back to the bread. But underneath the eating and the small talk in the lit and roaring country, Harry was already building the board. He did it the way he had taught himself to do everything, alone in the dark, with no help and no tools but his own attention. He had no names yet for most of it, so he gave it names himself, the way he had named the spiders in the cupboard when he was small and needed company. He named what had been done to him the cage, and the net that had torn the leash, and the hot knot behind his scar the passenger. He named the old man with the kingfisher robes the steward, because the steward had been managing something that was not his, and managing it well. He named the cold man in black the watcher, because the watcher had looked at him with the eyes of a man assigned to a task he hated. He named the turban the door, because the passenger had tried to go through it, and he did not yet know to where. He laid these pieces out across the dark board of his attention, and he looked at them the way he had never been allowed to look at anything, because for the first time in his life the lights were on, the whole vast country of him lit and humming in his, and a boy who has spent 10 years thinking in the dark thinks very fast indeed when someone finally turns on the lights. The steward built the cage, he reasoned, eating bread he barely tasted, nodding at something Ron said. The cage held the magic and it held the passenger and it ran the leash. 3 jobs, 1 working. Why 3 jobs and 1 working? Because the 3 jobs serve 1 purpose. What purpose is served by keeping my magic locked, the passenger asleep and me on a leash all at the same time for 10 years, starting when I was a baby. He turned it. He had all night. He had years, the hat had said. The magic locked so I stay weak, the leash so I stay steerable. Those two go together, they make a thing that is small and biddable and grateful. But the passenger, why keep the passenger asleep and alive? You do not keep a thing asleep that you mean to be rid of. You destroy a thing you mean to be rid of. You keep a thing asleep that you mean to use, later, when it suits you. The cage was not a prison for the passenger. It was he reached for the word, and the lit country gave it to him casually, the way it had been giving him words and shapes all night, vocabulary surfacing out of the returned flood as though it had been waiting in the vaults, a stasis. A held breath. The steward did not seal the passenger away to protect me from it. He sealed it to keep it fresh. The cold went all the way through him then, colder than the passenger, a clean cold that had nothing to do with magic. He set his bread down. He picked it back up because the boy would not stop eating, and the boy was eating. Keep the boy weak so he cannot interfere. Keep the boy steerable so he can be moved into place. Keep the passenger asleep and fresh so that when the time comes it can be woken, used, spent. I am not the patient, I am the container. Something is being kept inside me, and I have been managed for 10 years to make sure it stays kept until the steward needs it. He did not know what the passenger was. He would not know for weeks, and when he knew he would wish for the clean ignorance of this first night. But he knew its shape now and its purpose and his own purpose, which was the worst thing he had learned in a night of learning terrible things. He was a vessel that had been raised to believe it was a boy, kept poor and weak and grateful by a kind old man who checked every day that the vessel was keeping time, against the hour when its contents would be wanted. The hat had asked him the better question. Who profits from a weapon that believes it is a boy? Now he had a second one, and he asked it of the candlelit hall, of the screaming lions and the heaped gold platters and the warm grandfatherly old man at the center of the high table who had smiled at him like a clock he was glad to wind. And what Harry thought, perfectly still inside the burning country, smiling at Ron, ducking his head at the twins, the very picture of a happy boy who had finally come home, was I being saved for. He felt the steward's eyes leave him at last, satisfied. The clock was keeping time. The famous boy was sorted into the famous house, eating his first proper meal, dazzled and grateful, and exactly where he had been placed. Everything was going precisely to plan, and the plan was 10 years old, and the man who had built it was the cleverest man in the room and had every reason in the world to believe it was holding. He did not know about the hat. He did not know about the flood. He did not know that 32 minutes past the hour the leash had sheared apart in his hands and the cage had come down, and the vessel had woken with the lights on and started, very quietly over a plate of chicken, to take the entire arrangement apart. Harry let himself be led up to the tower when the feast was done. He walked in the middle of the crowd of first years, neither front nor back, learning the castle's stairs as they moved, which ones shifted, which portraits watched, where the suits of armor stood. He was tired now in a way that had gone past the body, a tiredness in the lit country itself, the deep ache of a thing that has been switched on after 10 years dark and is running at full pressure for the first time. He understood dimly that he would have to learn to carry this, that the power was not free, that the flood that had filled him would need a riverbed in discipline and time, or it would tear him apart from the inside the way it had torn the cage. That was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight there was only the work of being the boy, and the boy was tired, and the boy climbed the stairs. The common room was round and red and warm, a fire in the grate and squashy chairs and the smell of wood smoke, and it was, Harry thought, looking at it with the boy's wide pleased eyes, very well chosen. The hat had chosen well. No one would look for a weapon here. They would look in the dungeons, among the cold, ambitious children of the cold, ambitious house, and they would never think to look for it asleep by a Gryffindor fire with a smudge-nosed friend and a four-poster bed, the safest and most ordinary boy in the safest and most ordinary house, hiding exactly where the man who built him would rest easiest to find him. He climbed the last stair to the dormitory. 5 beds, hangings of deep red, his trunk already at the foot of one, and he stopped for half a breath just inside the door because the boy would stop, because it was the first bed in the first room that had ever in his life been his. That was real too. He let it be real. He had decided somewhere over the chicken that he would not let the work eat the few real things he had, because a vessel that kept nothing real would have nothing left to fight for, and he intended to fight. So he let the bed be his, and the room be his, and the small, fierce, private joy of it be his, for exactly as long as it took to cross to the bed and sit on the edge of it and feel the mattress give under him. Then he put the joy away gently where he could find it again, and he lay back on the first bed that had ever been his, and he closed his eyes, and in the dark behind them the cold-lit country stretched away forever, vault on burning vault, and far down in the oldest room of it the passenger lay coiled and watching, and out past the broken cage 100 torn silver threads drifted loose in the dark, frayed ends reaching back the way they had come, toward a hand that did not yet know it held nothing. All right, Harry told the country and the passenger and the 100 dead threads and the man at the center of the high table 40 feet and 1,000 calculations away. All right, you wound me for 10 years and I never felt the key turn. You will not feel it either. I am going to be the best clock you ever built. I am going to keep perfect time. I am going to be so grateful and so weak and so exactly the boy you made that you will never once think to check the lock. And while you are not checking, I am going to learn every name on this board. The steward, the watcher, the door, the passenger, the leash, whatever you were saving me for. I am going to learn what you did and how you did it and who helped you piece by piece in the dark with the lights on where you cannot see. And then thought Harry Potter, 11 years old, 1 hour into the rest of his life, with a country of fire inside him and a cold thing behind his eyes and not one single person in all the world who knew what had happened tonight on a stool under an old hat. I am going to take it apart. All of it, every thread, and you are going to help me do it, and you are never going to know until the night I let you. He slept. He did not dream of the cupboard. For the first time in his life, he did not dream of the cupboard at all. He dreamed of a country with the lights coming on, terrace after terrace, all the way up into a dark that had no ceiling, and somewhere very far down, in a room he had not opened yet, a cold, patient thing dreamed alongside him, and waited, and was glad in its small, dense, hungry way to no longer be alone. Above the sleeping castle, the rain moved off and the stars came out, and in a high tower a man with a silver beard sat awake a while longer than the rest, as he often did, going over the pieces of a very long game in the firelight. The Potter boy was placed, Gryffindor as expected, brave, transparent, easy to keep close, easy to read. The seal had held through the sorting as it had held through every test these 10 years, quiet and perfect and invisible. There would be time now to begin the slow, gentle shaping of the boy toward the role the war would need him to play, and the boy was grateful, and gratitude was the softest leash of all and never chafed. Everything was proceeding, the old man thought, with the calm of a craftsman who has checked his work precisely as it should. He banked the fire and went up to bed, and he did not look in on the boy because there was no need, because the clock was keeping perfect time. It was. Already that first night it had begun to keep perfect time. That was the entire problem, and he would not understand it for the better part of a year. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The managed boy Harry woke before the others in the gray hour and lay still in the first bed that had ever been his and took inventory of himself. The country was still there. That had been the night's last fear, that he would wake to find the flood drained back behind some healed wall, the lights gone out. The boy returned to the small dark room he had lived in for 10 years. But it was there, lit vast, his humming at a lower pressure now, the riverbed beginning to learn its own water. And far down, the passenger, coiled and quiet, a cold weight behind the scar that had not been there 2 days ago and would never be gone. He did not get up. He had a great deal of work to do before breakfast, and all of it could be done lying perfectly still with his eyes shut, which was the only kind of work he had ever been allowed to do unobserved. He was going to go back through his whole life. He had never done it before, there had been no point. The past was the cupboard, and the cupboard was the past, and a boy does not study his own cage when he believes the cage is simply the shape of the world. But the hat had told him the shape of the world was a thing someone had built, and Harry believed the hat, and so he was going to take his own 10 years out of the box and look at them in the new light and find the maker's hand in them. He started at the beginning with the only fact he had ever been given about it. Your parents died in a car crash. Aunt Petunia had said it the way you recite a thing you have been told to recite, flat, no detail, the same 8 words every time he asked for 10 years. Don't ask questions had been the rule of the house, the first rule, the rule under all the other rules, and he had thought it was cruelty. He looked at it now in the new light and saw that cruelty did not need a rule. Cruelty was free. A rule was a fence, and you only build a fence around a thing you do not want crossed, and the thing Petunia did not want crossed was the truth about where he came from. She had been instructed. The flat recitation, the identical 8 words, the panic in her face whenever he pushed, that was not a woman protecting her comfort. That was a woman following a script she was afraid to break. Someone had given Petunia Dursley a script and a fear strong enough to keep her on it for 10 years. He set that down on the board and named it, the ledger. Whatever held Petunia, money, threat, magic, the old letter he had once seen her hide, it was an arrangement, and arrangements have terms, and terms have a holder. He did not know the holder's name. He knew the steward's name was the only name on the board so far, and he resisted the pull to write it everywhere, because a board where every piece is the same piece is a board you have stopped reading. Hold it open, he told himself. The ledger has a holder. The holder is probably the steward. Probably is not yet, move on. He went forward through the years, and now that he was looking he found the maker's hand everywhere, in things he had lived through 100 times and never seen. The accidental magic. Every magical child had it, he knew that now, from a month of overheard Diagon Alley talk, the bottle that flew to the cot, the shattered window, the hair that grew back overnight. He had never had it, not once. He had reached as a small boy in the worst moments, the locked cupboard moments, the Dudley's gang in the alley moments. He had reached for something. Some power he had felt was there, the way you reach for a light switch in a dark room you know has one. And the switch had never been there. He had decided he was imagining it. He had decided he was ordinary and worse than ordinary, a boy so empty that even the wishing came to nothing. He looked at that emptiness now with the lights on and understood, with a flat, clean anger that he allowed himself for exactly one breath, that the switch had been there. The power had been there, the whole vast country of it, lit and waiting behind the wall, and the cage had eaten every reach. That was the leash doing its work, not just keeping him weak, keeping him convinced. A boy who has reached for his power 100 times and found nothing learns not to reach, learns he has nothing. Learns to be grateful for scraps and afraid of his betters and small, always small, because smallness is the only safe size for a thing that believes it is empty. You did not just lock the country, Harry told the absent steward, one breath of anger and then the breath let go. You taught me I had no country. That was the clever thing. The lock could have failed any day. The belief would have held forever. He breathed out the anger and kept the fact, Mrs. Figg. He came to her almost last, and she was the cleanest find of all, because the moment he held her up to the new light, she stopped making sense as the thing he had always taken her for and started making perfect sense as something else. A batty old cat lady 3 streets over, who had minded him a dozen times a year for 10 years, whenever the Dursleys wanted him gone, and the Dursleys hated paying for anything, and never once had Harry seen money change hands. Free childcare, reliable, geographically convenient for a decade, from a woman who showed him photographs of cats for hours and asked, in her wandering, harmless way, a remarkable number of questions about what Harry had been doing and feeling, and whether anything strange had ever happened to him. The relay he named her and felt the grim satisfaction of a piece falling exactly into its slot. She watched, she reported. She was the eye that made sure the clock kept time between windings, posted 3 streets from his door for 10 years, free of charge, asking after his every strangeness. And she was placed, and the Dursleys were scripted, and the country was caged, and the leash held 4 workings, and the same hand behind all 4, building a containment around an infant so complete that the infant had grown to 11 inside it and never once seen a wall. Harry opened his eyes. The gray light had gone gold at the window. Somewhere below, the castle was waking, pipes knocking, a far door, the first feet on the stairs. He had perhaps 20 minutes before the dormitory stirred, and he had learned what the night had to teach him, and the lesson came down to one sentence which he turned over once, cold and complete. He had not been neglected by accident. He had been neglected on purpose, as a method, by a careful hand, for an end he was only beginning to see, and the neglect had been load-bearing. The cupboard, the hunger, the hand-me-downs, the not asking, the no friends and no praise and no one, none of it was the Dursleys being cruel, though the Dursleys had enjoyed it well enough. It was a design. Keep the vessel poor and friendless and grateful and small, so that when a kind old man finally reached down into its life with a letter and a smile and a world of wonders, the vessel would imprint on him like a beaten dog on the first warm hand, and follow that hand anywhere, into any war, toward any end, and call it love. It had nearly worked. That was the part Harry made himself look at without flinching. The night before, on the stool, the warm grandfatherly look from the high table had reached something in him that wanted, the same starved thing that had loved Mrs. Figg's cats for want of anything else to love. If the seal had held one more day, he would have walked into that warmth and shut the door behind him and been the steward's grateful boy forever, and never known the door had a lock at all. One more day, he thought. I had one more day before I became what you built. And an old hat leaned the wrong way at the right minute. He did not believe in luck, he had never had any. He believed in margins, and that one had been thin enough to frighten him. He got up. He dressed in his cousin's old clothes, because that was what the boy owned, and he went down to breakfast and was the boy, and the boy did the work of being a happy, dazzled first year for the whole of his first morning at Hogwarts, and did it flawlessly, while underneath it the operator never slept. The first rule he set himself over porridge, watching the hall the way a delighted child watches everything: reveal nothing. Not power, not knowledge, not the knight on the stool, not 1 degree of the cold lit thing behind the boy's face. Not to Ron, who was kind and open and could not keep a secret to save his life, and was, for exactly those reasons, the perfect friend for a boy who needed to look like he had nothing to hide. Not to the bushy-haired girl who already knew every spell in the textbook and watched the room with the bright, anxious hunger of someone keeping score. Not to a single soul, until he had a reason measured in survival and not in loneliness, because the night had taught him that the loneliness was the wound the steward had cut him precisely, so that he would spend his whole life trying to fill it, and the first place a starved thing spills its secrets is into the first warm hand. Verify before you act, he set down second. He had a board full of names and not one of them proven. The steward was a deduction, strong but unconfirmed. The ledger's holder was a guess. He would treat every piece as a hypothesis until the castle handed him proof, because an operator who acts on guesses gets one move and then gets caught, and he intended to have years. Build leverage, he set down third, and did not yet know what his first lever would be, only that a boy with no money, no allies, and no standing needed leverage the way he needed air, and that the country inside him was leverage of a kind no one at this table could imagine, and must therefore stay hidden longest of all. Then the owls came, and the timetables, and the morning swept him up into the ordinary current of school, and Harry let it carry him, watching everything, saying the right small things, the most unremarkable boy in the most unremarkable house, learning the board. His first lesson with the hook-nosed man in black came on Friday, in a dungeon that smelled of cold stone and pickled things, and Harry walked into it already certain of one thing: the Watcher had been waiting for him. He had known it since the high table, since the look that held too old a grievance for a stranger. He had spent the week confirming it sideways. The way the black eyes found him in corridors and slid off, the way older students lowered their voices about Snape with a respect that had fear braided through it. A clever, dangerous, bitter man, feared by children and trusted by the steward enough to be set at the school. Watcher, Harry had named him, and the name had held, and now he was going to test it. Snape took the register, and at Harry's name he paused, exactly as the hall had paused, and looked up, and the black eyes came down the room and fastened on Harry with that same too-old weight. Then, before the class had so much as opened a book, he came for him. "Potter," he said softly, and the dungeon went quiet. "Our new celebrity." The word curdled in his mouth. "Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry felt the whole class turn to look at him, felt the bushy-haired girl's hand shoot into the air beside him, felt the trap close, a question pitched at a first year to humiliate a first year, designed to produce a stammer and a blank in the small public proof that the famous boy was nothing special after all. And the country gave him the answer. It came the way the words had come on the stool, surfacing out of the returned flood without effort. Asphodel and wormwood make the draught of living death, a sleeping potion so deep it counterfeits the grave, there whole certain, a thing he had never read and somehow knew. He held it behind his teeth and looked at it for a quarter of a second, and in that quarter second he made the most important decision of the morning. He let himself fail. "I don't know, sir," said the boy, and made his voice small, and let his eyes drop, and let the bushy-haired girl's hand stretch higher in frustrated certainty beside him. Because the watcher was not asking about asphodel. The watcher was taking a reading. Harry could feel it. The black eyes were not the eyes of a man enjoying a cruelty, or not only. They were the eyes of a man checking a gauge, the same checking the steward had done from the high table, the assigned attention of someone who had been told to monitor the boy and report. And a gauge that reads frightened, ignorant, ordinary is a gauge that sends a comfortable report up the line to the hand that wound the clock. A gauge that reads a first year who knows the draught of living death he was never taught is a gauge that makes a careful man frown and write a careful letter and start to watch the clock more closely than the clock could afford. So Harry failed twice more through asphodel and bezoars and monkshood, while Snape's contempt curdled and the bushy-haired girl nearly came out of her seat, and he watched the watcher take his comfortable reading, ordinary week, nothing here, and he banked it, because every comfortable reading the watcher sent up the line was another day the steward did not check the lock. "Clearly," Snape said at last, soft and final, turning away, "fame isn't everything." He took 5 points from Gryffindor for Harry's cheek, which Harry had not offered, and the class flinched, and Harry let his face do wounded and confused, and inside the cold-lit place set down a new and useful fact. "The watcher hates me before I have done anything. That is not about me. A man does not carry a grievance that old toward an 11-year-old he has never met. He carries it toward someone the 11-year-old resembles." Harry had seen in the single photograph Hagrid pressed on him in the alley his father's face, his own face, grown, laughing. "He hates my father. He has been set to guard my father's son. He does it because the steward told him to, not because he wants to. A man who serves where he hates serves under a compulsion, a debt, an oath, a leash of his own." And a leashed servant was the most exploitable piece on any board, because a leashed servant resents the hand that holds him, and resentment, properly found, is a door. "Watcher," Harry confirmed and added beneath it, in the cold ledger of the board, "bound, not loyal, find the binding." He did not look at Snape again for the rest of the lesson. But once stirring a potion he could have brewed in his sleep and deliberately brewed at the level of a clumsy child, he let his attention drift up out of the dungeon and across the castle, idly, and it brushed, very far off, the cold knot behind his own scar, and the knot was awake, and it was not looking at Snape at all. It was looking north and up toward a tower he had not been to, toward the thin, nervous man in the turban, and it was yearning. A low, constant hunger pointed like a compass needle, and the needle never wavered. Harry put it down, but he had his answer to a question from the stool now, or the shape of one. "The passenger points at the door, always. Whatever is behind that turban, the thing in my scar wants to go to it, the way a piece of a thing wants the rest of the thing." He did not let himself finish the thought. It went somewhere cold and enormous, and he was not ready for it. And an operator does not chase the largest piece on the board before he has secured the small ones. He left it where it lay, marked and untouched, and went back to ruining his potion with the competent incompetence of a boy who was learning that the safest thing in the world to be was disappointing. Transfiguration taught him the price of his own discipline, and the lesson came from the sharpest eyes in the castle after Snape's. Professor McGonagall did not waste the first lesson on speeches. She turned her desk into a pig and back, to a ripple of awe, and set the class to the week's true work, a match into a needle. And then she walked the rows with the still attention of a woman who had been reading the difference between talent and effort in 11-year-olds for 40 years. And Harry, who could have turned the match into a needle, into silver, into a living silver fish, with a thought and no wand, sat over his match and did the hardest thing the morning asked of anyone in the room. He failed it convincingly in front of her. It was harder than failing in front of Snape, because McGonagall was not looking for a celebrity to humble. She was looking honestly for what each child could do, and honest attention is far more dangerous to a liar than cruel attention, because it has no story it wants to find. Harry gave his match a faint silver sheen and a point too blunt to sew with, the work of a diligent, unremarkable child who was trying, and he watched her eyes pass over it and over him and find nothing to fix on, and felt the specific cold effort of holding the whole country still under a gaze that would have seen any flourish. The match wanted to become a needle. The country wanted to let it. He held both down and produced mediocrity, and it cost him more concentration than the transfiguration itself ever would have. She paused at his desk a half-second longer than at the others, and Harry's pulse did not change while every alarm in the country rang. "Keep at it, Mr. Potter," she said, neither warm nor cold, and moved on, and Harry understood that he had passed narrowly and learned the rule that Snape's class had only suggested. The danger was not the people looking for a famous boy to be special. He could disappoint those forever. The danger was the people looking, plainly and without agenda, for the truth of what a child could do, because the truth was the one thing his whole performance was built to hide, and an honest teacher hunts the truth by instinct, the way the twins hunted seams. He marked McGonagall as the second gauge in the castle after the Watcher, and resolved to feed her too, the steady boring diet of a boy who tried hard and stayed ordinary, and never once let her see the silver fish the match could have been. He lay awake that night doing the arithmetic of his own concealment, and found it heavier than he had expected. 2 teachers now whose attention he had to manage by hand, and a headmaster who checked him like a clock, and a watcher set to report. 4 sets of eyes, each clever, each different, and a single slip in front of any of them could end the game. He had thought on the stool that hiding would be the easy part and the war the hard part. He understood now that the hiding was the war this year, that every lesson was a battle fought with his own restraint, every silver match a small victory of will over the thing in him that wanted, simply and fiercely, to be what it was. It would have broken a weaker boy, the sheer daily cost of being less than himself in every room. But Harry had spent 10 years being less than himself in every room of a house that hated him, and doing it now, with the lights on and a country at his back and a reason of his own choosing, was not a burden at all. It was the first time in his life the smallness had been his idea. The Quirrell lesson came 2 days later and confirmed it. Defense against the dark arts, taught by the stammering man in the turban, in a classroom that reeked of garlic, and something underneath the garlic that the garlic was there to hide. Professor Quirrell stuttered his way through a lesson on counter-jinxes, jumping at shadows, and the class half laughed and half pitied him, and Harry sat in the 3rd row and did the most disciplined thing he did all week. He felt the scar burn the instant he entered the room, the white needle of pain, the passenger lunging on its compass needle toward the front of the class, and he did not flinch, did not touch his forehead, did not let the boy's face register so much as a wince. He held the passenger down with the same will he had used on the stool and watched Quirrell over the top of it, and what he saw made the cold-lit place go very still. The stutter was wrong. He could not have said how he knew except that the country let him see it. The stutter came and went on the wrong words, broke in the wrong places, the way a thing breaks when it is being performed rather than suffered. The flinching was theater. The garlic was a wall built to hide a smell. And underneath all of it, when Quirrell turned his turbaned head a certain way, there was a pressure in the room, a second presence the way Harry's own skull now held a second presence, and the passenger behind his scar strained toward it like iron toward a magnet and recognized it, and the recognition was the coldest thing Harry had felt since the stool. There are 2 of them, he thought, behind the boy's polite bored face, while Quirrell stammered about hinkapunks. 2 cold things in this castle that the thing in my scar reaches for like family, one behind that turban, one in me. They are the same kind of thing. He did not name it. He could not yet. He did not have the word, and he had learned in a week of operating that naming a piece before you understood it locked you into the first guess. But he drew the line on the board, faint and terrible, from the passenger to the door, and wrote beside it the only thing he was sure of, a second predator, not the steward S. Or not only the steward S, circling the boy who was supposed to stay small, 2 hands now, the stewards which had built him and meant to spend him on a schedule, and this one, the cold thing behind the turban, which wanted something it had not got yet, and which the passenger answered to as if to its own blood. Harry walked out of defense with his scar quietly screaming and his face perfectly mild, and understood that the board was larger and more dangerous than he had let himself believe on the stool, and that he had even less time than the hat had promised, because the hat had not known about the door. The largest source on the board turned out to be the kindest, and Harry found him by being found. Hagrid, the vast wild-bearded keeper of the keys, had been the one to take Harry to Diagon Alley, and he had a fondness for the boy that was entirely genuine and entirely unguarded, and a tongue that ran ahead of his judgment whenever his heart was engaged. Harry took tea in the hut on the edge of the forest in his 2nd week, not because the boy wanted rock cakes, but because the operator had recognized in the alley the single most leak-proof and capable witness in the steward's whole confidence, a man who loved Dumbledore without reservation, and would therefore never imagine that anything he said about Dumbledore could do harm. So Harry sat by the fire with a dog drooling on his knee and asked the questions a curious orphan would naturally ask, in the order a curious orphan would naturally ask them, and let Hagrid pour out, between rock cakes, a year's worth of intelligence without once suspecting he was being read. He learned that it was Hagrid who had carried him out of the ruins at Godric's Hollow the night his parents died, carried him, an infant, on Dumbledore's instruction, to a corner of Surrey, on a flying motorbike borrowed from a man named Sirius Black who had gone bad, or was said to have. He learned that Dumbledore had been there that night, waiting in the dark of Privet Drive, with the stern witch from the Sorting and a plan already made. He learned that the whole of it, the placing, the timing, the choice of the aunt's doorstep, had been Dumbledore's, arranged within hours, as though the man had known what to do with an orphaned infant before the infant was even cold from the fire. He did not improvise that night, Harry thought, smiling at Hagrid over his tea. He executed. A man does not have a plan for the survivor ready by morning unless he has been thinking about the survivor for a long time, unless he knew before it happened that there might be one and what he would do with him. It confirmed from a loving and unimpeachable witness the thing the elf had told him in the dark. The management had begun the very first night. And he learned, near the bottom of the second pot of tea, the thing Hagrid should not have told him and could not help telling him, because Harry asked it as a frightened child asks the thing that frightens him most. Were his parents really killed in a car crash? And Hagrid went purple with indignation on his behalf. Car crash, the very idea, as if a car crash could have killed Lily and James Potter, and told him, before he could stop himself, the truth the Dursleys had been scripted to hide, that his parents had been murdered by a dark wizard, the worst there had ever been, and that Harry had survived, and that the survival had made him famous, and that no one quite knew why a baby had lived where grown wizards had died. Harry let his face do the shock and the grief, which were not entirely performances. But under them the operator banked the most important sentence Hagrid had spoken. The one Hagrid had not known was a clue. No one quite knew why a baby had lived. No one but Dumbledore, who had walked into the manor the next night and taken the accounts and sealed an elf and built a cage. He knew why I lived, Harry thought, scratching the great dog's ears. He knew that night, or worked it out within days, that a piece of the murderer had lodged in the child, that the child was a reliquary. Everyone else got a miracle. He got a problem and a solution and 11 years to execute it. And the one man who could have told the world the truth instead built a cottage of lies around it and posted a keeper at the door. He thanked Hagrid for the tea and meant it, because Hagrid had just handed him more of the board than any other source all term and would never know it, and because the giant's uncomplicated kindness was, like Neville's, a real thing in a year of cold ones. He walked back up to the castle in the grey afternoon with the giant's affection warm in his chest and the giant's testimony cold on the board, and found, not for the first time, that the two could live in him at once without either being a lie. He found his first lever that same week, and he found it by accident, which was the only way a boy with nothing finds anything. It happened in the Gryffindor common room late after the others had gone up. A round-faced first-year named Neville Longbottom sat by the dying fire nearly in tears, turning out his pockets and his bag for the third time because he had lost his toad again, a toad named Trevor that Neville lost roughly twice a day. Tonight no one had helped. Neville was alone with his guilt over a lost animal in a castle full of cats, and he was the kind of boy, Harry saw at once, who would sit up all night blaming himself rather than ask. Harry knew that boy. Harry had been that boy in 100 ways, the one who broke things and lost things and was the trouble in every room and learned to apologize before anyone accused him. And the warm, walled-off corner of him, the corner he had promised himself he would keep, opened a crack. He could find the toad. That was the simple truth of it. The country inside him could reach out into the dark castle and feel for one small living warmth among the cold stones as easily as a hand finds a coin in a pocket, and that was exactly why he could not do it openly, not in a way that revealed a single degree of what he was. So he did it the boy's way. He came and sat by Neville and said in the boy's ordinary voice that toads liked damp and warm and that the airing cupboard near the dormitory stairs was both, and would Neville like a hand looking, and while they walked the dark corridor together, Harry let one thin invisible thread of the country uncoil from him, quiet as a held breath, just far enough to brush the castle, just lightly enough that no ward and no watcher and no steward could have felt it. And found Trevor in 9 seconds in exactly the airing cupboard he had named. There, he said, opening the door, letting Neville's hands close on the toad, letting Neville's whole round face crumple with relief. Lucky guess. It was not a guess and there was nothing lucky in it, but Neville did not need to know that, and Harry banked what he had actually been buying with 9 seconds of risk, not a toad. An ally, the first one. A boy with no guile in him, no agenda, no place in the steward's calculations, because who would think to watch a forgotten, fumbling first year who could barely hold his wand, and a loyalty Harry could already see would be absolute, because Harry had given Neville the one thing no one else had bothered to. He had treated the lost toad as if it mattered, and treated Neville as if he were not the trouble in the room. Light, Harry told himself, walking back up to the dormitory with Neville chattering grateful and bright beside him. Keep it light, do not make him a tool. Make him a friend and let the friendship be real, because a real friendship is the only kind the steward cannot read, and because, and here he let the warm corner stay open one more second, because the night had also taught him that an operator who keeps nothing real will have nothing to fight for, because I would like, just once, to have done a kind thing for its own sake, in a life that was engineered so I never could. He let it be real. Then he put it away where he could find it again and went back to the work. The last thing happened on the edge of sleep, and it was the largest. He had given up that first week on reaching the one piece of his old life that might be a tool. The Potters had been a family, a wizarding family, and families had things, property, vaults, retainers, and somewhere in the wreckage of what the steward had taken from him, there might be a thread the steward had missed. But he had no idea how to reach for it, no name to call, no door to knock on, and he had nearly let it go. He was lying in the dark, the country humming low, the passenger quiet, sorting the week's findings one last time before sleep, and on the edge of a thought, half dreaming, frustrated, he reached, the way the small boy in the cupboard used to reach for the light switch that was never there. He reached for home, for the idea of it, for whatever in all the world was his and not the steward's and not the Dursleys'. And he said in the country, not aloud, a single word he did not know he knew, an old word that surfaced out of the flood the way the asphodel had, a word that tasted of a house he had lived in for 15 months and could not remember, Pelin. For a moment, nothing. The dark, the breathing of the other boys, the low hum of the country. Then beside his bed, where there had been no one, there was a cracking sound like a knuckle popping in the dark, and a pair of enormous luminous eyes opened a foot from his face, and a thin reedy voice that shook with 10 years of grief and disuse whispered, Pelin hears. Pelin hears the young master call. After all these years they kept Pelin from him, the young master calls. Harry lay very still, his heart going hard, the country flaring up bright and ready behind his calm, and understood that he had just found his lever, that a thread the steward had missed had answered to a word out of a dead house, that there was a creature in the world bound to him, to the Potters, to the old wards of a home that had been taken from him, and that this creature had been kept from him for 10 years and had been waiting all that time for the young master to remember its name. Pelin, Harry said, the boy's voice gone and the operators come quietly up in its place, because there was no one awake to hear, and a lever this large had to be picked up correctly the first time. Don't make a sound, don't pop away, and tell me everything. The night they took you from me, the man who gave the order, the house we lost. We have a great deal of work to do, you and I. The huge eyes filled and shone in the dark. Yes, Pelin breathed. Oh yes, young master. Pelin has waited so long to be asked. Harry drew the bed hangings closed around them both and laid one finger of the country against the air inside the curtains, a thread too fine to ring the lowest ward in the castle, and folded the sound of their voices inward so the other boys slept on. Then he listened while the elf poured out 10 years in the dark. It came in pieces, half grief and half true, and Harry took the true half. The Potters had been a house, old, not rich, but old, with a manor in the West Country that Pelin had kept since before James was born, and the manor had wards keyed to Potter blood, the kind of defense that did not fall so much as go to sleep when the last of a line was too young to hold it. On the night the young master's parents died, Pelin had felt the great wards go dark all at once, the way a house goes dark when the hearth is put out, and had keened alone in an empty manor 100 miles away, and waited for the call that bound elf to master to tell it where its boy had gone. The call never came. That was the thing that had broken Pelin, and the thing that lit the cold place in Harry like a struck match. An elf bound to a house could always find the last of its blood. It was the oldest magic there was, older than wands. Pelin should have been at Harry's side the night his parents died and every night after. It had not. Something had stood between elf and boy for 10 years, not killed the bond, which could not be killed while both still lived, but blocked it, muffled it the way a hand muffles a bell. The same wall, Harry understood with cold certainty, that had stood between him and his own power. One working many jobs, the cage had locked the country and slept the passenger and run the leash and cut him off from the one creature in the world bound to find him. Who? Harry breathed. Pelin. The night the wards went dark. Did anyone come to the manor? The huge eyes squeezed shut. One, the word shook. The night after, an old wizard, silver-bearded. He walked through the dark wards as if they were not there. Pelin could not stop him. The house had no master to lend Pelin strength, and he went to the master's study and took papers and a key, and the little gray book the master kept his accounts in. He stood in the hall before he left, gentle like he was sorry, and he said to the empty house, "It is better this way. The boy must grow up small or he cannot grow up at all. One day he will understand." And then he bound Pelin from speaking of it and from seeking the boy, and he left. And Pelin could not follow and could not tell and could not find the young master for 10 years, until tonight the wall came down and the young master remembered Pelin's name. Harry lay back against the pillow and let the last piece settle onto the board with the weight of proof, the first hard proof he had owned since the stool. The gray book was the ledger. The silver-bearded wizard who walked through dead wards and took the accounts and bound an elf to silence and said it is better this way was no longer a deduction. He was a witnessed man in the Potter study the night after the murders, hands on the family's money and the family's secrets, a story already prepared about why the boy must grow up small. He took the ledger himself. He has held it 10 years, probably is. You did nothing wrong, Harry told the elf, quiet, because Pelin was shaking with the old guilt of a creature that believes it failed its one duty, and because it was true. You couldn't have come. He made certain of it, you and me and the money and the wall between us all in one night. You're the first piece of my own life I've got back, and you came the instant I called. Now I need you to wait a little longer, and it will be the hardest thing I ever ask. Tell no one I called you. Come only when I speak your name as I did tonight, and find me 3 things slowly so the looking is never seen, where he keeps that grey book, what the wards of our manor would answer to now, and the name of anyone still living who served our house. Can you do that? Pelin can, the elf whispered, fierce now beneath the grief. Pelin will. The young master is awake. The young master remembers. It pressed its forehead once to the back of Harry's hand, a gesture older than the castle, and at his nod was gone between one breath and the next without so much as a crack. Harry lay alone again in the curtained dark, the board grown by one proven name and one living lever, and let himself feel, for a single breath, the size of what he had started. Outside the window the stars wheeled over the sleeping castle, and in a high tower a careful man slept the sleep of a craftsman whose work is holding, and did not feel the first bolt of his containment quietly slide free, 3 streets and 10 years and one forgotten elf away from anything he had ever thought to watch. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Mapping the board. October came to the castle in a wash of cold rain, and Harry used it. He had spent September learning the rule that governed everything else. A thing the size of the country could not be hidden by holding still. Holding still had saved him on the stool, but a dam does not stay a dam by being ignored. The flood needed a riverbed, channels, discipline, a shape to run in, or it would rise on its own schedule and tear out of him in some classroom in front of 40 witnesses and end the long game before it began. So he taught himself at night behind drawn bed hangings with Pelin keeping watch at the door, to run the country the way a man learns to run a great engine he has been handed without a manual, one valve at a time, listening for the strain. The first thing he learned was that the magic did not need the wand. He had suspected it since the dungeon, when the answer about Asphodel had surfaced whole and unbidden. The wand was a tool the world had built for children who had to be taught to reach a power that lived just out of their grasp. It focused a thin draw through a narrow channel and made a clumsy thing precise. But Harry's power did not live out of his grasp. It lived in him, lit and vast, and when he wanted a thing to happen he found he could simply decide it and shape the decision and let one fine thread of the country do the work. No wand, no word, no light. The first night he tried it, he meant only to lift a feather off his trunk. The feather did not lift. The trunk did, an inch off the floor, silent, and every glass in the dormitory hummed, and Harry set it down very fast and sat in the dark with his heart going, and understood that the problem was not whether he could do magic. The problem was that everything he did came out the size of the country, and the country was far too large to show anyone, and so the whole discipline of his power would have to be a discipline of making it small. That became the work. Not learning spells, the spells were in him, surfaced out of the flood faster than Flitwick could teach them. A whole education's worth of theory waiting in the lit vaults like books in a library he had inherited and never read. The work was control. Throttling the country down to a trickle, then to a thread, then to the precise least amount that would lift a feather and not a trunk, until he could stand in charms and wave his wand and produce, on command, exactly the wobbling, half-failed levitation of a diligent first-year who was trying hard and not quite getting it. He practiced being mediocre with the focus other children gave to being good. It was the hardest magic he did all term, and no one would ever know he had done it. The runes came with the rest, and the runes changed how he saw the castle. Ancient runes was not taught until 3rd year, but the literacy had flooded back with everything else, and so Harry walked through Hogwarts reading a layer of it that his classmates could not see. The castle was written on. Every threshold, every old door, every stone that had stood since the founders, there were marks worked into them. Some so old they had gone soft as river stones, some sharp and recent, and they were not decoration. They were instructions, wards, the grammar of who may pass and what may enter and where the walls have ears, laid down in a language Harry had been given in a single night and most wizards spent years learning to stammer. He began quietly on his way to lessons, to read the castle the way you read a city's street signs, and the castle began to tell him things. It told him first about the watching. He had assumed surveillance from the start. The relay at Privet Drive meant the steward did not leave his assets unobserved, and a careful man does not stop watching a thing merely because he has moved it inside his own walls. But assuming a thing and finding it are different, and in the 2nd week of October, reading the runes around the entrance to Gryffindor Tower while pretending to wait for Ron, Harry found it. A mark cut into the underside of the lintel, fresh, no more than a few years old, worked in a hand that was elegant and economical and unmistakably the hand of someone who had done this a great many times. It was a notice charm, not a recording, subtler than that and worse. It noted passage. It would not tell the caster what Harry did or said. It would tell the caster in some far tower the simple fact of when the boy came and went, the rhythm of him, the pattern, the times he kept. Clock face for a clock, the steward was still winding by habit, checking that it kept time. Harry read the mark 3 times, committed its grammar to the vaults, and did the thing that took more discipline than anything he had done since the stool. He left it exactly as it was. The pull to unmake it was enormous. He could see how the rune had a closing stroke that reversed would unwrite the whole working, and no one would feel a first-year do it because no one believed a first-year could read it at all. But an unwritten word is a silence where there used to be a sound, and a careful man notices silences faster than he notices anything, because silence is the one thing surveillance is built to make impossible. If the notice charm went dark, the steward would know within a day that something at Gryffindor Tower had learned to read runes and chosen to blind him, and there was exactly one new variable in the castle that fit that description, and the whole long game would collapse into a single obvious suspect. So Harry left it lit, he let it watch him. He went in and out of the tower on the rhythm of an ordinary boy, kept the clock face honest, fed the watcher a pattern so dull it would put a careful man to sleep, and he began, in the margins of it, to map the rest, because a man who marks one threshold marks others. Over the following fortnight, Harry walked the castle reading its, watching the way the marauders, had he known of them, had once mapped its passages, and he built in the vaults of the country a map no parchment held. Here a notice charm, there an old portrait whose painted eyes tracked too deliberately, here a suit of armor that stood a half-inch out of true with the others as though it had been turned to face a door. He found the shape of the steward's attention laid over the school like a net, and he found, studying the net, the thing the net told him that the steward had never meant it to. The net was densest in 3 places: the corridor to Gryffindor Tower where his assets slept, the dungeons where the watcher worked, and a 3rd-floor corridor on the right-hand side, sealed and forbidden, watched more heavily than anything else in the castle, a corridor that had nothing to do with Harry at all. He is guarding 2 things, Harry thought, standing at the foot of the moving stairs with a charms book he was not reading. Me, and whatever is down that corridor. And he is guarding the corridor harder than he is guarding me, which tells me the corridor's contents are either more valuable than I am or more dangerous, and I have spent a month establishing that he thinks I am the most valuable object in his entire long game. He turned it over, cold and patient. So either there is something in this castle he values more than the weapon he raised from infancy, or there is something down that corridor he is afraid of. And a careful man does not bring a thing he is afraid of inside his own walls unless he has to. Unless it is bait or a vault, he did not go to the corridor. An operator who walks toward the most heavily watched door in the building on the strength of a guess is an operator who has decided to be caught. He set the corridor down beside the door and the passenger in the dangerous part of the board, and he kept reading. Pellin brought him the rest of it, a piece at a time, across October in the small hours. The elf had done its waiting magnificently. It came only when Harry breathed its name into the warded dark, stayed only minutes, brought 1 thread each time and vanished, and the threads were gold. The grey book, the ledger, was not in a vault, Pellin reported. It was in the steward's own office in the castle, in a drawer of a great clawed desk, behind a lock that answered to the steward's voice. It held, Pellin had glimpsed once across 10 years in a memory the binding had only half buried, columns of figures in the steward's hand, monies moved from the Potter accounts, year on year, in sums small enough to escape a goblin's quarterly notice, into channels Pellin could not read. Not stolen, Harry thought, studying it, administered. He did not empty my vault, that would have left a hole the goblins would have flagged. He skimmed it, and he spent the skimmings on something, and a man keeps a private ledger of his spending only when the spending is the kind he cannot explain. The order, perhaps, the war that had not started yet, but that the steward was so certain would come that he had built a weapon for it out of a baby. Harry did not know. But he had the location of the proof now, and the lock that held it, and the patience to wait until he could open that lock without the whole castle hearing the click. The wards of the manor Pellin could only describe in pieces, because the manor's wards were asleep, and a sleeping ward keeps its own counsel. The elf knew one thing that mattered more than the rest. The wards would wake for Potter blood freely given, and for no other thing on earth, and they had been asleep so long that whatever the steward had taken from the study he had been able to take only because there had been no master alive and old enough to deny him. The house is still mine, Harry understood, and felt the warm walled-off corner open half an inch at the thought of a home he could not remember and had never stopped owning. Asleep, but mine. A place in the world the steward holds the key to but does not own. When I am ready, I have somewhere that is not his. He put it away. It was not a tool yet, but it was the first ground he had ever stood on that the steward had not built under his feet, and a man fighting a long war needs ground. The last thing Pellin brought was a name, and the name opened a door Harry had not known was there. The young master asked for any who served the house and still live, the elf whispered, the third week of October, eyes enormous in the dark. There is one, not a servant, a friend of the mistress of the young master's mother, a witch of the house of bones. The mistress and she were close as sisters at school, and the witch grieved long, and she has a niece at Hogwarts now in the yellow house. Pelin does not know if the aunt remembers a debt. But the mistress saved her life once in the First War, and the house of bones pays its debts. They are a house of law. The aunt sits high in the Wisengamot and rules on the law itself, and Pelin has heard the elves of other houses say there is no one in Britain the silver-bearded wizard can less afford to have asked the wrong question. Harry lay in the dark and felt a new piece come onto the board, and it was not a piece of the conspiracy. It was a piece of his own. A house of law, he thought. An aunt at the top of the only body in this country with the authority to ask the steward a question he would have to answer under oath. A debt owed to my mother, and a niece here in the castle my own year, whom no one is watching because no one watches Hufflepuffs. He turned it over and turned it and saw the shape of a weapon he could build that the steward would never see coming, because it was made entirely of legitimate things, of law and debt and friendship, the boring daylight machinery of the world, which a man who fought with seals and leashes and secret ledgers had perhaps forgotten could be turned against him at all. He would have to do it carefully. He would have to approach the niece as a boy approaches a classmate, not as an operator recruiting an asset, because Susan Bones was 11 and owed him nothing and would, if handled like a tool, become a liability who told her terrifying aunt that the Potter boy was strange. He would have to make a friend, a real one the way Neville was real. And he would have to be patient because a house of law moved on proof and not on the word of a child, and he did not yet have proof he could put in front of a Wisengamot, only an elf's bound testimony and a ledger he could not yet reach, and a story no one would believe about a seal that broke backwards on a sorting stool. Patient, he told himself, as he told himself most nights now. You have years, the hat said, years. Build the daylight weapon slowly, in plain sight, out of homework partnerships and shared tables and a kindness done for its own sake, and let it become law before the steward ever knows there was a case to answer. He met Susan Bones the next morning, over a dropped stack of library books in a fourth-floor corridor, and he did it the only honest way he knew, which was to actually help her pick them up. She was round-cheeked and red-plated and quick, and she thanked him without making anything of it, and Harry walked her to the library with an armful of her books and talked to her about nothing, about herbology, which she liked, and about how the moving staircases never went where you wanted on a Monday, which she laughed at, and at no point did he mention her aunt or the law or his mother or anything at all that an operator would have mentioned. He simply made it pleasant to be near him, which was a thing he had never once been allowed to be in his old life, and which the country, oddly, made easier, because a boy who is no longer starving for warmth can afford to give some away. By the end of October, he and Susan studied together twice a week, Neville often with them, the three of them at a corner table in the library with their homework spread out, and it was, Harry noted with the part of him that never stopped noting, the safest place in the castle, because 3 quiet first-years doing their herbology essays were the single most invisible object in all of Hogwarts, and one of them was reading the wards on the windows while the other 2 argued about flobberworms. The flying lesson nearly cost him his discipline, because the broom answered him the way nothing else in the castle did. Madame Hooch lined the first-years up on the lawn with a school broom apiece and told them to say up, and half the brooms rolled over in the grass and the other half leapt into shaking hands, and Harry's came to his palm before the word was fully out of his mouth, smooth and eager, and he felt, the instant his fingers closed on it, that flying was a thing the country knew the way it knew runes and spells, a buried fluency surfacing whole. When they were allowed to rise, a yard off the grass, he had to hold himself down by main will, because the broom wanted to climb and the country wanted to let it, and some part of Harry that the cupboard had never reached wanted, fiercely and simply, to go up and not stop. He had not known he wanted anything that purely. He held it to a yard, wobbling like the others, and ached. It was the round-faced boy who gave him the cover to feel it. Neville's broom bucked and threw him. The boy came down hard on his wrist with a crack and a cry, and Hooch swept him off to the hospital wing with a warning to the rest to keep their feet on the ground. And in the loose, frightened minute after she'd gone, a broad, pale boy from the Snake House, Malfoy, who had already marked Harry as a rival worth baiting, snatched something from the grass where Neville had fallen, a little glass ball that filled with red smoke, and kicked off into the air with it, jeering, daring anyone to come and take it. Harry took it. He told himself it was for Neville, and it was, mostly, and he told himself he kept it ordinary, and he did barely. He kicked off and went up after the pale boy, and he let the chase look like a first-year's reckless luck, but the broom answered the country and not the boy, and for 10 seconds, climbing, banking, plucking the glass ball out of the air in a dive that should have killed a child who had never flown, Harry stopped being careful and simply flew, and it was the first unmixed joy he had felt since the stool, the country and the wind and the falling sky, and a thing he was wonderful at for no reason but that he was. Then he remembered himself and made the landing clumsy, and let the catch look like an accident, a braver fool than he had survived, and McGonagall, who had seen it from a window, came striding across the lawn with her face caught between fury and astonishment. He thought for one cold second that he had overplayed it, that the catch had been too clean, that the Watcher's gauge had a sister now in the Transfiguration Mistress. But she only marched him off to install him, over his protests, as the youngest house Quidditch player in a century, and Harry understood, walking beside her brisk, indignant stride, that he had been handed something useful. A sanctioned reason to be conspicuously, ordinarily talented at one harmless thing. A boy who is good at Quidditch is a boy whose competence has somewhere safe to go, a lightning rod for any brilliance that slipped the mask, drawing the eye to a broom and away from everything else. He let McGonagall make him a seeker, and resolved to be merely very good at it, and never once great, and to let the whole school explain his strangeness with a sport. Pellin brought the other piece that same week, and it turned the term's reading toward Gringotts. The elf had been tracing the grey ledger's spending, the channels Harry could not read, and it had found one thread that ran somewhere unexpected. A withdrawal not from the Potter vault, from somewhere else, an old high-numbered vault in the deepest part of the bank, had been made on the steward's authority that summer, in the days before term, and the thing withdrawn had then come to Hogwarts under heavy guard, and the elves of the castle had felt it arrive and felt it carried to the third-floor corridor. Whatever is down that corridor came out of Gringotts this summer, Harry reasoned, in the warded dark. A thing valuable enough to keep in the deepest vault in the wizard world, that the steward judged safer here in a school behind the traps of half his staff than in the bank that has never been robbed. He did not move it here to store it. You do not move a thing from the safest place in Britain to a school full of children for storage. He moved it here as bait, somewhere the enemy could reach for it and be caught reaching. The corridor was not a vault after all. It was a trap with the bait already laid, and the steward had laid it, certain already that the enemy was near enough to take it. Harry set that on the board, beside the door in the troll curtain, and felt the year's clock speed under his hand. Snape he handled differently, because Snape could not be befriended and must instead be measured. Harry had decided by mid-October that the Watcher was the most dangerous piece on the board after the steward and the door, and the most useful if he could be read correctly, and so Harry made a study of him with the cold patience he gave to the wards. He learned the man's moods by the set of his shoulders, his attention by the track of his eyes, and he learned, watching, the thing the dungeon had first suggested. Snape's surveillance of Harry was real, constant, and resentful, and it ran on rails the Watcher had not chosen and could not leave. The proof came in a single moment in a corridor. Snape rounded a corner and found Harry alone, no class, no witnesses, the perfect setting for a man who wished a boy ill to do the boy some quiet harm, and Snape stopped and looked at him with the old curdled loathing and did nothing. He could have taken points for breathing. He could have invented a detention. Instead he stood there hating Harry with his whole face, and then turned and swept away, and Harry understood, watching the black robes go, that the Watcher was not free to harm him. Could not. Was forbidden it by the same hand that had set him to watch, because a careful man does not let his resentful servant damage his most valuable asset. And so the steward had bound the Watcher not only to guard the boy but to keep him whole, and the binding chafed the Watcher like a collar, and the Watcher hated the boy and hated the collar and could not tell from inside it which he hated more. Bound to guard, bound not to harm, hating both, Harry set down on the board. He is a leashed dog set to guard a thing he would rather bite. That is not loyalty. That is a man serving a hand he resents, for a reason older than I am, the debt I can see in him, the grief under the hate. He had seen it once when Snape thought no one watched. The man had looked at Harry's eyes, his mother's eyes. Hagrid had said, "You have your mother's eyes," and something had moved in the Watcher's face that was not hate at all, that was older and worse than hate. And Harry had understood that whatever bound Snape to the steward's service had been forged out of the same fire that had killed Harry's parents, and that it had to do with Harry's mother, and that it was therefore the most exploitable thing on the entire board. Because it was the one thread the steward held that the steward had not made, he had only found it and used it the way he used everything. Not yet, Harry told himself, because the Watcher was a door he could open exactly once and must open at exactly the right time. But when I need him, the way to him is not through the boy he hates. It is through the woman he is still grieving. Remember that. The bushy-haired girl nearly undid him in the last week of October, and the near miss taught him the only thing his discipline had not. Hermione Granger kept score. Harry had marked her in the first week, the relentless hand in the air, the textbook memorized, the bright anxious need to be right that he recognized because it was the same need worn inside out, hers facing the world and his facing a board no one else could see. She was the cleverest student in their year by a wide margin, and cleverness was the one quality on earth that could see through the act of mediocrity Harry had spent 2 months perfecting, because mediocrity only fools people who are not paying attention, and Hermione paid attention to everything. It happened in charms. Flitwick set them the knockback jinx, and the room filled with the usual first-year flailing, and Harry produced his careful half-failure, and Hermione, 2 seats over, frowning, said not to him but to the air, "That's the third time you've made it fail the same way." She turned, and her eyes were narrow with the specific suspicion of a person who has noticed that a pattern is too clean to be an accident. When people can't do a spell, they fail differently each time. You fail it the same way. Like you know exactly where to stop. For a quarter of a second, the whole long game stood on the edge of a cliff, and Harry looked at it and stepped back from the edge by doing the one thing the operator in him had not thought of and the boy in him knew by heart. He did not deflect or lie or perform a deeper incompetence. He let his face fall into the honest, hunted embarrassment of a child caught at something shameful, and he said low so only she could hear, "Because if I do it right the first time, everyone looks." He let that sit. "I grew up somewhere it wasn't safe to be good at things. You learn to stop just before anyone notices. I didn't know I was still doing it." And he let her see for one unguarded breath, a real thing, not the largest real thing, not the country, but a true one, the true shape of a boy who had been punished for standing out, and Hermione's suspicion collapsed into something that horrified her more than a cheat ever could, because she was 11 and kind under the keeping score, and she had just been told a thing about another child's home that she did not know how to hold. "That's awful," she said very quietly and looked away and never raised the question again. Harry walked out of Charms with the cliff behind him and a new rule learned, and the rule was the hardest of all of them. The cover that hides a lie is another lie, and another liar can read it. The cover that hides a secret is a truth, a smaller true thing, offered freely, that satisfies the watcher because it is real. He had been protecting the country with performances. Hermione had nearly seen through the performance in a fortnight. From now on, when someone clever pressed, he would not give them a better act. He would give them a true thing, a real wound, a real history, the genuine damaged boy the Dursleys had in fact made, and let the truth of the small thing stand guard over the secret of the large one. It cost him something each time, spending pieces of his real history as camouflage. He decided the cost was acceptable. He had a great deal of real history, and almost none of it was anything the steward could use. That night he tested the edge of his control properly for the first time, because the near miss had shown him he did not yet know his own limits, and a man who does not know his limits cannot stay safely inside them. He went after midnight to the one place in the castle the wards did not watch, an unused classroom on the 4th floor, behind a door whose notice charm had gone soft as a river stone a century ago, a blind spot he had found while mapping the net. Pellin kept the corridor, and in the cold dark with no wand, Harry opened the throttle of the country one notch past anything he had let himself reach since the sorting, and held it there and learned. He learned that he could feel every living thing in the castle if he reached: the sleeping students, the cat that haunted the dungeons, the centaurs at the wood's edge, 1,000 warm points scattered through the dark stone. He learned that he could read the wards not one at a time now, but all at once, the whole written skin of the castle lighting up in his mind like a city seen from a great height, and that somewhere in that lit map the 3rd-floor corridor burned hotter than anything, layered with protection that bore the hands of half the staff. He learned that when he reached far enough, the passenger woke and reached with him hungry, and that he could hold it, that the discipline that throttled the country also caged the fragment, the same while doing both jobs, and that this was either his greatest safety or his greatest danger, and he could not yet tell which. And he learned the thing he had gone there to learn, which was where the bottom of his power was, and the answer was that he could not find it. He pushed in the dark, empty room until the air sang and the dust lifted off the floor in a slow-turning sheet and frost crept across the windows in ferns, and the country did not strain, did not near any wall, did not so much as deepen its hum. He had reached, he understood, perhaps 1/100th of what was in him, and it had bent the room, and there was no edge in sight. 10 years of a wizard's growth, dammed and compounded and returned all at once, in a vessel that had also been built by the same careful hand, for the same careful purpose, to hold a piece of the most powerful dark wizard of the age. The steward had needed a strong box for what he meant to keep. He had made the box too strong, and then he had broken his own seal, and the box had become a boy who could frost a window from across a room with 1/100th of a power that had no floor. Harry let the throttle close. The dust settled. The frost held on the glass, fading slowly, the only witness, and Pellin would see it gone by morning. He stood in the dark and did not let himself feel the size of it as triumph, because triumph was a thing that made operators careless, but he let himself feel it once as fact. He was already at 11, with a fraction of his power and none of his training, very probably stronger than anyone who would ever come hunting him. The danger had never been that he was weak. The danger was that the two men who meant to use him both still believed he was, and his entire survival depended on their belief, and the belief would hold exactly as long as he could bear to keep frosting windows in empty rooms at midnight where no one would ever know. He could bear it a long time. He had borne worse for less. The first week of November, the door moved, and Harry got to watch the steward play. It came as a troll. A mountain troll somehow loose in the castle on Halloween night, in the dungeons, then not in the dungeons, and the whole school was herded to its common rooms in a roar of panic while the staff went to deal with it, and in the chaos Harry stood very still in the Gryffindor crowd and read the night the way he read the wards and saw it for what it was. A troll does not wander into Hogwarts. The castle's outer wards would scream at a flobberworm crossing them wrong. Harry had read those wards, nothing the size of a mountain troll walked through them by accident. Someone had let it in. And on the one night of the year when the whole staff was occupied and the castle's attention was pointed at a rampaging monster in the dungeons, the most heavily watched door in the building, the third-floor corridor, had every eye in the castle turned the other way. The troll is a curtain, Harry thought, in the noise and the crush. Someone wanted the staff looking at the dungeons so that no one would be looking at the corridor. The door made a move on whatever the steward is guarding up there. He felt the scar give one hard pulse, the passenger straining north and up as it always did, harder tonight, and he held it down and read the rest. The move had failed or half failed. The net of the steward's attention had a snag in it by midnight, a place where the watching had been tested and held. But it had been tested. The cold thing behind the turban had reached for the thing behind the corridor, and Harry now knew 3 facts he had only guessed before. That the door wanted what was in the corridor, that the steward was guarding the corridor against the door specifically, and that the two of them, the kind old man and the cold thing in the turban, were already at war in this castle over an object Harry had not yet named, with Harry's whole long game balanced unknowing between them. 2 predators, 1 prize. And a boy in the middle who both of them believed was small. He almost had it then. Standing in the loud, bright common room with the troll panic washing around him and the scar pulsing and the board lit up in his mind brighter than it had been since the stool, Harry almost saw the whole shape of it, almost set the door and the passenger and the corridor and the war side by side and read the single sentence they spelled. But the sentence was too large, and he was 11, and he had taught himself the discipline of not chasing the largest piece. And so he stopped at the edge of it, breathing, and made himself walk the deduction one careful step at a time instead, in the dark after the others slept. What does the door want? He asked the warded dark, with Pellin curled watchful at the foot of the bed. It wants what is in the corridor. What is in the corridor is something the steward values or fears enough to guard above all else. The door is a cold thing the passenger answers to as its own blood. The passenger is a cold thing sealed inside me, kept asleep and fresh for the steward to use in something he called a return. He laid them in a row, a return. The steward built a weapon me and sealed a fresh cold thing inside it against the day of a return he was planning for. The door is a cold thing that wants back something hidden in this castle, badly enough to loose a troll for cover. And the passenger reaches for the door like a piece reaches for the rest of itself. The last word stopped him, a piece. He had been calling it that for weeks without hearing it. The passenger reaches for the door the way a piece of a thing reaches for the rest of the thing. He had meant it as a figure. Now in the dark, with the board lit and the troll night fresh and the discipline that had held him back all term finally loosening one notch, he heard it as a fact, and the fact opened under him like a trapdoor. The passenger was not a creature that had been put inside him. It was a piece, a fragment. Part of something larger that had been broken, and a part of it had been sealed in him, kept asleep, kept fresh, and the rest of that same broken thing was somewhere close, close enough that the fragment in his scar strained toward it, close enough that it had loosed a troll to reach what it wanted, and it wore at present a turban and a stutter and taught defense against the dark arts on the 3rd floor of a school where its other piece slept behind a boy's eyes. Harry lay in the dark and felt the cold go all the way down, past the country, past everything, into the oldest part of him. He did not have the name yet. He would not say it, even now, even to himself in the warded dark. The hat had refused to name the thing in his scar even in an empty hall, and Harry had learned to trust the hat's fear. But he had the shape of it now, the true shape, the shape the steward had spent 10 years and 4 workings and a whole engineered childhood to keep him from ever seeing. There was a thing in the world that had been broken into pieces. One piece was in him. Another piece was in the castle, hunting the corridor. And the steward, the kind old man who had skimmed his vault and scripted his aunt and posted a watcher 3 streets from his cupboard, had not sealed the piece in Harry to protect Harry from it. He had sealed it to keep it, asleep, fresh, whole, a piece of something he meant one day in a return he had been planning since before Harry could walk to put back together. I am not the patient, Harry thought, the sentence he had first reached for over a plate of chicken on the very first night, complete now and terrible. I am the box he is keeping a piece of the enemy in, and the enemy wants its piece back. And the day the steward decides to open the box, the day of his return, is the day I was always meant to die, because you cannot give back a piece of a broken soul without breaking open the thing that held it. He breathed. The country held steady, lit and vast in his, and far down in the oldest room of it the passenger lay coiled and listening, and for the first time Harry let himself look at it directly, the cold, dense fragment behind his scar, not as a monster, not yet as an enemy, but as a fact, a known quantity, a piece on the board that he had finally seen for what it was. All right, he told it, the way he had told the country and the dead threads and the man in the high tower on the first night. I know what you are now, or near enough. You are a piece of something they broke. They put you in me to keep, and one of them means to take you back, and that means whatever happens to you happens to me. So you and I are going to come to an understanding, you and I, before either of them is ready. I'm going to learn exactly what you are and what holds you, and whether the thread that ties you to me can be cut without cutting me. And until I know, you are going to stay exactly where you are, and you are going to stay quiet, and you are going to point that compass needle at the door whenever I ask, because as long as you reach for it, I always know where the other piece is. The passenger stirred, cold and slow, and did not answer, because it could not yet. It was asleep mostly, a fragment dreaming. But the compass needle of it swung north and up, toward the third-floor corridor and the turbine, and the war Harry now stood unseen in the middle of, and held there steady, pointing. Harry watched it point, and let the long game grow by one enormous piece, and slept. In the high tower, the steward sat late over the wreckage of a Hallowan that had nearly cost him more than the school would ever know, and reassured himself that the boy had spent the night safely in his common room, oblivious, small, exactly as he should be, and went over his pieces, and found them as ever in their places, and did not once think to wonder whether the smallest piece on his board had, sometime in October, begun quietly to read the board back. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. The diary's echo. He put a name to the corridor's prize in December, the week before the castle emptied, and he did it through Hermione Granger, who collected names the way other children collected sweets. He had learned, after the near miss in charms, that the safest way to use the cleverest girl in the year was not to hide from her but to point her, to set her a puzzle she could not resist, and let her brilliant, relentless curiosity do work the operator could not do in the open without being marked. So when the three of them were in the library, Susan deep in a herbology chart and Neville asleep over his astronomy, Harry let drop idly that he'd overheard the name Flamel somewhere and wondered who it was, and watched the hook set in Hermione's eyes and said no more. She found it in 3 days, because of course she did, and presented it with the triumph of a girl who has solved a thing no one asked her to solve. Nicholas Flamel, the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone, a stone that turned any metal to gold and produced the elixir of life which made the drinker immortal. 665 years old, Flamel, by virtue of the stone. A friend, the books noted, of Albus Dumbledore, with whom he had once done alchemical work. Hermione laid it all out, delighted, with no idea she had just handed Harry the keystone of the whole board, and Harry let his face do impressed and grateful, and banked the name under the coldest heading he owned. The name closed the last gap in the autumn's board. He had known since November that the thing in the corridor came out of Gringotts's bait. Now he knew what the bait was, and why no bait on earth would draw the door more surely. The enemy had torn his own soul to escape death, and wanted, above all things, a body that would never die, and the one object in Britain that could make one was the Philosopher's Stone, made by Dumbledore's own old friend, laid out behind the traps of half the staff in a school full of children. The two halves of the year's puzzle closed on each other like a clasp. Harry let his face stay impressed and grateful, and thanked Hermione, and meant to spend his empty holiday learning the trap's geography from the inside, against a night he could already feel coming. Harry waited until December to look the passenger in the eye, because some things should be done when the castle is half empty, and no one is counting heads. Most of the school went home for the holidays. He stayed, the boy had nowhere else, which was true, and the operator wanted the castle thinned of witnesses, which was truer. Ron's family swept Ron away in a tide of red hair and noise. Susan went home to the House of Bones with a promise to write. Neville's grandmother collected him with a falcon-eyed nod that took in Harry's threadbare coat and said nothing. By the 3rd week of December, the Gryffindor dormitory was Harry's alone. The corridors were long and silent, and the snow came down past the high windows in a hush that swallowed sound. It was the most privacy he had owned in his life. He spent it learning to enter his own mind. He had no name for the discipline and no teacher. The country had not flooded him a manual for this, only the raw capacity, but he had reasoned his way to its necessity over weeks. If the passenger was a fragment of the enemy sealed inside him, and if the war between the steward and the door was a war over the broken thing the fragment belonged to, then the single most important object on the entire board was the fragment itself, and he knew almost nothing about it. He did not know what holding it cost him. He did not know whether it could read his thoughts, whether it had been listening all term to every plan he made in the warded dark, whether the cold thing that woke when he reached too far was awake more often than he believed. He did not know the one fact his survival turned on, whether the thread that bound it to him could be cut without cutting him. And there was exactly one place those answers lived, and it was behind his own eyes in the oldest room of the country, where the fragment lay coiled and dreaming. So he went in. He did it slowly over days, as he did all things now, building the discipline a wall at a time. He learned first to quiet the country to glass, the whole vast lit thing gone still and clear, so that a single thought dropped into it sent rings to every shore and he could watch them travel. He learned to walk the levels of himself down and down, past the bright vaults where the spells lived, past the channels he had cut for his power, into the dark below the dark, where the architecture of him went old and strange and the snow light did not reach. And on the fourth night, at the bottom of himself, in a room he had felt since the sorting and never opened, he came to the passenger and he looked at it. It was not a monster. That was the first thing and the worst, because a monster he could have hated cleanly. It was a fragment. He saw that now from the inside, saw the torn edges of it, a thing that had been ripped from something larger with terrible violence and sealed here while the wound was still raw, 10 years ago, in a vessel too young to feel the intrusion. It was dense and cold, and it dreamed, and its dream was a single image repeated, the way a damaged thing repeats. A green light, a woman's scream, a high cold laugh, and under all of it a hunger so total it had no object anymore, hunger as a permanent condition, the hunger of a thing that had been broken in the act of trying to make itself immortal and had been broken ever since. Harry stood at the threshold of the oldest room and did not go in, because some thresholds you do not cross until you know the way back. And he reached out very carefully, one fine thread of the still glass country, and he touched the dreaming fragment, the way you touch a sleeping animal to learn if it bites. It did not wake, but it answered. It answered the way a struck bell answers, and the note it rang was not Harry's, and the memory that came up out of the touch was not Harry's, and for one endless second Harry was somewhere else, somewhere that had never happened to him, and could not look away. He was in a room he had never seen, narrow and gray, a boys' dormitory in some other school in some other year, and he was holding a thin black book, and he was writing in it, and the writing sank into the page and vanished, and a voice that was his own and not his own thought, in a register of cold delight Harry had never felt and recognized to the marrow. I will not die. I have made certain of it. I have torn the soul and hidden the pieces, and there is no power on earth that can find them all. Let them try. Let the old fool try. I have built myself a road around death, and I have only begun to walk it. And under the thought, hot and patient and bottomless, the same hunger, younger here, sharper, still wearing the face of a clever, handsome boy who had decided that the unmaking of his own soul was a price worth paying to never, never end. Harry tore the thread loose and came up out of the oldest room so fast he nearly lost the glass, and sat in the dark dormitory with the snow falling past the window and his heart slamming and a cold in him that had nothing to do with December, and made himself, hand by hand, walk the deduction the memory had handed him, because the memory had handed him everything. Torn the soul, hidden the pieces. The fragment in his scar was a piece of a torn soul, and it was not the only piece. There were others. The enemy had said pieces, plural, had built a road around death out of them, had hidden them where no power on earth could find them all. The cold thing in the turban was another piece, walking, hunting the corridor, and the corridor held a third thing, or held the key to one, something the enemy needed to come back, something the steward was guarding against the day the walking piece could reach it. Harry sat in the dark and let the architecture of it finally assemble, the whole shape he had refused to chase since the sorting, and it assembled into a single cold sentence, and the sentence was the truth the steward had spent 10 years burying. The enemy had not died. He had broken his soul into pieces to escape death, and one of the pieces had lodged in Harry the night his parents were killed, and the steward had found it there, in the infant, in the survivor, in the boy who lived, and the steward had not destroyed it. He had sealed it, to keep it. Asleep and fresh and whole, behind a boy raised small and weak and grateful, against the day the enemy made his return, so that on that day the steward would hold a piece of the enemy's own soul, intact, in a vessel of his own making, his own card in a game he had decided to keep playing rather than end. Harry breathed in the dark and let the last and worst piece settle, the one the memory had not given him but the architecture demanded, the one about himself. You cannot keep a piece of a soul alive in a living vessel forever. A piece sealed in a boy is a piece that grows with the boy, sinks roots, becomes load-bearing in the architecture of the host. And when the day came that the steward wanted the piece, to bargain with it, to bait the enemy with it, to destroy it at the chosen hour and call it the death blow, there would be only one way to get it out. The vessel would have to break, the boy would have to die. I am the seventh thing he is keeping, Harry thought, not knowing the number was nearly right, knowing only that it was a thing kept and not a child protected. He did not raise me to be a hero. He raised me to be a reliquary, a safe place to store a piece of the enemy until the hour he needs it, and the hour he needs it is the hour I stop being useful, because you cannot open the reliquary without breaking it. The green light, the scream, the high cold laugh dreamed on, far down in the oldest room, in the piece that had been put in him to keep. The steward has been planning my death since before I could speak, not as a tragedy, as a step. The destined hour, the noble sacrifice, the boy who must die so the world can live. He has been writing that ending for 10 years, and the whole engineered childhood, the cupboard and the hunger and the gratitude was rehearsal, so that when he finally tells me I have to die, I will be so grateful to the only man who is ever kind to me that I will lie down and let him do it and call it love. He did not weep. He had wept all the tears the Dursleys were going to get out of him years ago in the cupboard, and there were none left over for the steward. Instead, he sat very still in the snowlight and felt the cold clarity settle over the country like ice over a lake, hard and clear and load-bearing, and he made the second great decision of his life, the one that followed from the decision he had made on the stool. He was not going to die on the steward's schedule. He was not going to die on the door S either. And he was not going to spend the rest of whatever life he could win in terror of the fragment behind his eyes, because terror was a leash too, the last one, the one the steward had not even had to build because the truth would build it for him the day Harry learned it. The steward had probably counted on that, had probably planned that the boy would learn the truth eventually, near the end, and be so frightened of the thing in his own head that he would run straight into the arms of the only man who understood it. Even the truth was a trap, Harry thought, almost admiring the cold clarity holding. Even my own horror was supposed to be a leash, so he refused to be horrified. He looked at the fragment dreaming its greenlit dream in the oldest room of him, and instead of fearing it, he began that night to study it, because a thing you understand cannot frighten you into anyone's arms, and a thing you understand can sometimes be used. The studying taught him to build a cage of his own, and the cage was the great work of that frozen, empty Christmas. He could not destroy the fragment. He established that first by careful reasoning, because acting on it wrong would kill him. The fragment had sunk roots through 10 years of his growth. It was braided into the architecture of the country the way an old tree's roots are braided into a wall, and he did not yet know which roots were load-bearing. Tear it out blind and the wall might come down with it. There were ways to destroy such a thing. The country whispered to him from its oldest vaults, fiendfire, basilisk venom, a handful of other unmakings, each of them a thing that destroyed past repair and could not tell the host from the parasite. None of them was safe to use on a piece sealed in living flesh, not until he knew exactly where the roots ran and which ones he could cut. And that knowing would take years and a kind of study he could not do here, and probably a teacher he did not yet have. So he would not destroy it. He would contain it, turn the fragment from a sleeping danger into a known, walled, watched quantity, a piece on his own board instead of the steward's. He built the cage over 12 days in the snow-silenced castle, and it was the most delicate magic he had ever attempted, because it had to hold the fragment without waking it and reinforce the seal without anyone outside ever feeling the seal change. He learned, building it, the shape of what the steward had made, and the learning was its own dark education. The original seal was still there, the steward's work, ancient and elegant and ruined, for it had been built to be opened by its maker on the chosen day, and the backwards rupture on the sorting stool had blown its locks off their hinges. The fragment was no longer sealed in. It was merely sleeping behind a door that no longer locked, in a vessel that had spent 4 months not noticing the door was open because the vessel had been too busy mapping the board. That was the danger he had not let himself see. The night the seal broke backwards, it had not only freed his power, it had unlatched the fragment's cage. The only thing that had kept the passenger asleep all term was the throttle, the same will that throttled the country, and a will sleeps when its owner sleeps, and Harry slept every night. He understood, building the cage in the cold, that he had been one bad dream away from disaster since September and never known it, so he built a lock that did not depend on his being awake. He worked it out of the runic literacy the flood had given him, a containment written into the architecture of the oldest room, keyed to nothing the steward could read and nothing the door could call to, a cage that would hold the fragment dreaming whether Harry waked or slept or fought or fell, and that would tell him, with a cold pull behind the scar, the instant anything tried the door from outside. It was not a prison. He had decided, somewhere in the 12 days, against a prison, because a prison the steward might one day feel and wonder at. It was a watch house. The fragment dreamed on inside it, exactly as before, pointing its compass needle north and up at the door whenever Harry asked. But now it dreamed inside a wall that was Harry's, written in Harry's hand, holding by Harry's will and by a will beneath will that did not sleep, and no one outside him would ever feel the difference, because from the outside the seal still read as the steward's broken seal, dim and dormant, exactly as a careful man checking his work would expect. On Christmas night he finished it and stood inside his own mind at the threshold of the oldest room, and watched the fragment dream its greenlit dream behind a wall he had made, and felt, for the first time since the stool, that the most dangerous thing in his life was a thing he held rather than a thing that held him. He did not feel triumph. He felt the specific, level steadiness of a man who has secured the one position he could not afford to lose, and who knows the battle has not started. Then he came up out of the country into the cold dormitory, where a single present sat at the foot of his bed, a parcel in brown paper, no card, a fluid silver cloak that pooled like water and turned his hand invisible when he drew it over his arm, and the steadiness sharpened into something colder. He knew an invitation when he saw one. The cloak was his father's. The country told him so the instant it touched his skin, old Potter magic singing to the blood that woke the manor's wards. And the cloak had come to him on Christmas night, anonymously in a castle nearly empty, with a single typed line he found tucked in the folds. Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well, no signature, none was needed. Only one man in the castle could have held James Potter's cloak for 10 years, and only one man would return it now, in winter, with no name and a nudge to use it well, and the use of an invisibility cloak, to an 11-year-old alone in a holiday castle with nothing to do, was obvious, and the obvious use led to exactly one place, because the steward had spent 4 months making sure Harry knew exactly one place was forbidden. He's steering me, Harry thought, the cloak cool and alive over his arm. He gives the boy his dead father's cloak and a hint to use it, and a forbidden corridor he has guarded so heavily that a curious child cannot help but wonder what is down it. He wants me to go to the 3rd floor. He wants the asset to find the thing he is guarding under the cloak alone in the dark, and to be, in finding it, exactly the brave, reckless Gryffindor boy he needs me to become, the boy who runs toward danger, the boy who can one day be pointed at the enemy and told to die a hero. The cloak is not a gift. It is the first page of the script. He is starting my rehearsal. He stood in the dark with his father's cloak, the one true thing the steward had given him, taken from a dead man and held for a decade and now spent as bait, and he felt the two things at war in him and let them be at war because he had decided long ago not to lie to himself about the cost of any of it. The cloak was his father's. He wanted it the way a starved thing wants food. It was the only object on earth his father had touched that Harry could hold. And it was a leash handed to him by the man who had murdered his childhood, to lead him to a corridor at the end of which the script said he would learn to be a martyr. He kept the cloak. He decided that in the first minute and did not waver. It was his father's and his now, and the steward had made the mistake careful men make when they have controlled a thing too long. He had assumed that because he understood the cloak's use as bait, the boy could only use it as the bait intended. But Harry had spent 4 months learning that the steward's gifts could be turned, and an invisibility cloak in the hands of an operator who could already read every ward in the castle was not a leash at all. It was the single most useful tool he had been handed all year. He would not go to the 3rd floor corridor, not yet, and not because he was told to. An operator who walks the path his enemy lays for him on the night his enemy lays it is an operator who has agreed to be read. He would go later on his own schedule for his own reasons, when he had decided the corridor was worth the risk, and in the meantime he would use his father's cloak for everything the steward had not intended. To read the wards no student could reach, to learn the castle's blind spots, to be in places an asset was never meant to be invisible, while the man in the high tower waited with quiet satisfaction for the boy to take the bait and start, obediently, becoming a hero. Use it well, the note had said. He intended to. He drew the cloak over himself in the empty dormitory and vanished, and stood for a moment looking at the place where his body had been, the snow light falling through him onto the floor, and let himself feel one clean thing about his father, not grief, which he had no memories to hang grief on, but a strange fierce kinship, because James Potter had owned this cloak and used it for mischief and defiance, and getting into rooms he was not allowed in, and Harry was about to do the same. Against the same enemy his parents had died fighting, with a piece of that enemy caged behind his own eyes. Hello, he told his father quietly the only way he could. I'm going to use it well, not the way he wants, the way you would have. Then he went to work, invisible, in a castle that belonged for 12 more days to him alone. Before he trusted the cage, he tested the one question it could not answer for him, how much the fragment had seen. It was the fear that had ridden under all the others since the night he understood what the passenger was. He had spent 4 months making plans in the warded dark with a piece of the enemy curled behind his eyes. If the fragment had been awake to those plans, if it dreamed his strategy and could, on the day the enemy returned, hand it all over, the whole long game laid bare to the very man Harry was playing against, then everything he had built was built on sand. So on the night after he finished the cage, with Pellin keeping the door, Harry ran the experiment he had been dreading, because a danger you refuse to measure is a danger that measures you. He went down into the oldest room and he watched the fragment dream, and then carefully he fed it a lie. He let himself think loudly in the part of the mind nearest the scar, a false plan that he meant to flee the country in the spring, take ship abroad, abandon the school and the war and run. He thought it the way a man thinks a thing he believes, and he watched the fragment to see whether it stirred, whether it took the thought in, whether it would carry the lie home to its master. It did not stir. The greenlit dream went on, unbroken, the scream and the cold laugh repeating, indifferent to the lie an inch away. And Harry understood, watching, the shape of his own architecture at last. The fragment did not read him. It dreamed, backward, inward, lost in the single torn moment of its own making, and it reached outward only along the one channel that was native to it, the compass needle that pointed always to the rest of the broken soul. It was not a spy. It was a shard of memory and hunger with a homing instinct, and the bleed between it and Harry ran one way, not two. He caught flickers of it, the borrowed memories, the scarfire when the door was near, the green light and the laugh, but it caught nothing of him, because there was nothing in it built to catch a person. It had been a piece of a man who never imagined his own soul could be held by someone he had not chosen. He let the relief come and pass in a single breath, because relief made operators careless and kept the fact which was better than relief. The fragment could not betray him. Whatever it had witnessed of his year, it had witnessed the way a stone in a river witnesses the water, without knowing, without keeping, without any means to tell. His plans were his own, and the one-way bleed was not only a safety, it was a weapon. He caught flickers of the enemy, and the enemy caught nothing of him. He could feel the door's nearness, read the scar's warnings, take the enemy's borrowed memories like intelligence intercepted from a courier who did not know he carried it, and give nothing back. For 11 years the steward had called the fragment a danger at the center of Harry that the enemy could open at will. The steward had been wrong or had lied. The fragment was not a door the enemy could open. It was a window Harry could see through, and the enemy could not, and Harry had just learned to keep the glass. He came up out of the oldest room with the last of his Christmas fear finally spent, and trusted the cage, and slept that night with a piece of the Dark Lord behind his eyes, and was for once entirely unafraid of it, which was, he thought, drifting off, a strange thing to have made of the worst gift anyone had ever been given, and a thing the steward had spent 11 years and a whole engineered childhood to make certain he would never learn how to do. He learned what was in the corridor without ever opening its door, which was the whole art of the thing. He went on the second night of his invisible holiday, not to the third-floor corridor, but to the edge of it, close enough to read, far enough to deny. He sat against the cold wall under his father's cloak at the limit of the ward net, and let the country read the corridor the way he had learned to read the whole castle from the empty classroom, a city seen from a height, and the corridor read back. Layer on layer of protection, the hands of half the staff written into it, a sprung trap of Sprout's green making, a flock of Flitwick's charmed keys, a board of McGonagall's transfigured war, a riddle in Snape's cramped venomous hand, and beneath them all at the bottom a thing the steward had set himself, the most elegant working in the castle, a mirror. Harry read the mirror's grammar from 40 feet away and did not understand it, and understood from not understanding it exactly what it was. It was a vault built as a test. It would give up what it held only to a person who wanted the held thing and did not want to use it, a lock that opened to intention and refused to greed, the cleverest kind of guard because no thief could pick it, since the wanting that drove a thief to pick it was the wanting that kept it shut. And inside the mirror, written so faint Harry caught only its edges, was a stone. He knew its name now, the Philosopher's Stone, Flamel's work, and the wards confirmed the single property they had been built to protect. It made gold, and it made the drinker of its elixir deathless. Deathless, Harry thought, in the cold under his father's cloak, and the whole board lit up at once. A stone that defeated death, guarded in this castle, behind every trap the staff could build, by the steward this year. And a cold thing in a turban hunting it since Halloween, a walking fragment of a wizard who had torn his own soul to pieces to escape death and now had no body, who needed, Harry saw it whole finally, the sentence he had been circling since the sorting, who needed a way back. The enemy was not dead and not alive. He was pieces. A piece behind the turban, sharing the body of a stuttering professor, too weak to hold its own form. And that piece had come to Hogwarts the moment it learned the one object in Britain that could make a body deathless had been hidden here, because a creature of broken soul and borrowed flesh wanted, above all things, a body of its own that would never die. The door was not just hunting a treasure. The door was hunting a resurrection, and it meant to take it now this year, uncontrolled, on no one's schedule but its own. That was the piece that changed everything, and Harry sat under his father's cloak in the freezing dark and felt the shape of the war he stood in the middle of finally resolve, and it was worse than 2 predators and 1 prize. It was 2 resurrections. The steward has a plan, he reasoned, fast and cold now, the board blazing, a controlled return. He has kept a piece of the enemy sealed in me for 10 years, fresh, against a day of his choosing, a day when he holds the cards, when the enemy comes back weak and on the steward's terms, into a trap the steward has spent a decade building, with the Boreliquary ready to be spent at the decisive hour. That is the return plan, that is what I was raised for. It is monstrous, but it is patient, and it is his. And the thing in the turban is the enemy refusing to wait. The piece behind the door did not know about the steward's plan, or did not care. It had found a shortcut, the stone, a way back that needed no patient decade and no sealed reliquary, a way to come roaring back to full deathless life this year on its own terms, ahead of the steward's schedule entirely. The return plan has a rival. And the rival is the master himself, or a piece of him, and he is trying to resurrect himself uncontrolled here now, against the wishes of the very man who has spent 10 years planning to resurrect him controlled. Harry almost laughed in the dark, a cold breath of something that was not quite humor. The 2 men who meant to use him were not allies and were not quite enemies. They were a jailer and a prisoner who both wanted the same door opened, one slowly, on his own terms, with the boy as his guarantee, the other now, by force, with the stone as his shortcut. And between them, holding a piece of the prisoner behind his eyes, stood a boy they both believed was small. Whichever of them wins, I lose, Harry understood, and it was the clearest thing he had understood all year. If the door gets the stone, the enemy comes back whole and uncontrolled and comes, sooner or later, for the piece of himself in my head and takes it the only way it can be taken, through my death. If the steward stops the door and keeps his plan, the enemy comes back later, controlled, on the day the steward spends me to do it. There is no version of their war that I survive by staying small. There's only the version where I stop the resurrection myself, both resurrections, and that means I have to be in this, really in it, before either of them knows I can be. He came up off the cold floor with the whole game in his hands at last and went back to his tower to think, and that was where Snape nearly ended him. It happened on the last morning of the holidays, in a corridor near the dungeons, and it was Harry's own fault, because he was thinking and not performing. He had spent the night turning the two resurrections over, and he came around a corner still half inside the country, his face carrying the cold-lit clarity instead of the boy's careful blankness, and Snape was there, and Snape saw it. For 1 second the Watcher looked at Harry Potter and did not see a frightened, ordinary first year. He saw what was actually there, a still, cold, calculating attention looking back at him out of an 11-year-old's face, an adult's attention, an operator-s, the eyes, Lily's eyes, green and quick, gone hard with a thought no child should be able to think. Snape stopped dead. Something crossed his face that Harry had not seen there before, beneath the habitual loathing. A flicker of pure, startled, professional alarm, the alarm of a legilimens who has glanced at a surface he expected to be shallow, and found it dropping away beneath him into a dark he could not see the bottom of. Harry shut it off in half a second, felt the slip, felt the Watcher catch it, and dropped the boy's blank, frightened face over the country like a portcullis, but half a second was half a second too long, and they both knew it. Snape's black eyes narrowed. He did not speak. He did not take points. He looked at Harry for 3 long seconds with an expression that had become terribly curious, and then he swept past without a word, robes snapping, and Harry stood in the cold corridor and understood that the most dangerous reader in the castle had just glimpsed, for the first time, that the clock was not keeping the time everyone thought it kept. He won't go to the steward, Harry thought, fast, running it, not yet. He saw something he can't name, and the Watcher does not report what he cannot name, he reports facts, and he has no fact, only a glimpse he half doubts already. But he will watch now, differently. He has stopped seeing the boy his master described and started seeing a question, and a man like that does not let go of a question. The board rearranged itself around the new danger. The Watcher had been a gauge sending comfortable readings up the line. The gauge had just twitched. If it twitched again where the steward could see, the long game ended. He could not afford a second slip. And he could not, he saw, simply hide harder from Snape forever, because Snape was bound to watch him for years, and a question in a clever man only grows. He would have to do, eventually, the thing he had marked in October, reach the Watcher not through the boy he hated but through the woman he grieved, turn the gauge before the gauge turned on him. Not now. But the clock on that had started ticking in a dungeon corridor, and Harry felt it start. He went up to his tower as the holiday ended and the castle began to fill with returning noise, and he sat by the window with his father's cloak folded under his pillow, and the fragment caged and dreaming behind his eyes, and the whole vast game finally laid out clear, and he did the only thing left to do, which was decide what kind of player he was going to be. He had spent autumn being small. He had mapped the board, named the pieces, built his levers, caged the passenger, learned he had no floor to his power. He had done it all hidden, patient, the disappearing boy in the safest house. And it had been the right play, and he did not regret a day of it. But the holiday had shown him the thing patience could not survive. There was a clock now that was not his. The door meant to take the stone this year. The enemy meant to come back now. And a boy who stayed small and hidden while 2 resurrections raced each other to his death was not a patient operator. He was a coward with good reasons. So I come in, Harry decided by the window as the snow stopped falling. Not openly, never openly, the mask stays, the mask is the whole game, but I stop only watching. The door is going for the stone, and the steward is going to let it get close, because the steward's whole plan needs the enemy to think he can win, and a steward who is using the stone as bait will let the trap spring shut at the last possible moment for maximum advantage. Both of them are willing to gamble my castle and my year and my life on their timing. I am not. I am going to find out exactly how the door plans to reach the stone, and exactly how the steward plans to let it, and I am going to put myself between the enemy and his resurrection, quietly in the dark, wearing my father's cloak, and deny them both. And the first move, he thought, watching the last flakes settle on the sill, the country steady and cold and bottomless behind the boy's calm face, is to make them keep believing, all the way to the end, that the smallest piece on the board cannot move at all. Term began the next morning. Harry went down to breakfast and was the boy, delighted by the returning crowd, shy with Susan, easy with Ron, kind to Neville, and no one at the long table and no one at the high one. Saw that something had changed in the holidays, that the disappearing first year had finished mapping the war and quietly entered it, and that the clock the steward kept winding by habit had, sometime in the snow, begun keeping a time of its own. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, Public Mask, Private War. The steward made his move in February, and Harry knew it was coming 3 days before it arrived, because a man who steers by gifts cannot resist the temptation to steer when he feels the wheel going light in his hands. The signs were small, and Harry had learned to read small things. The notice charms around Gryffindor Tower were renewed in late January, the old soft marks recut sharp, a man checking his instruments. The Watcher's surveillance had gone quiet and careful, the curiosity from the dungeon corridor banked but not extinguished, the black eyes finding Harry now with a new patience. And the steward himself, who for months had let the boy come and go on his dull honest rhythm, began to appear in corridors after meals, a kindly silver presence pausing to ask Harry how he was settling, whether he was sleeping well, whether the castle still felt strange. Warm, grandfatherly, attentive. A man Harry understood, taking readings of his own, a craftsman who had felt some faint wrongness in his instrument and could not place it and had come gently to tap the glass. He senses it, Harry thought, walking away from one such pause with his face full of shy gratitude and his mind gone cold and clear. Not the truth, nothing so sharp, but the clock is keeping a time he cannot quite account for, and a careful man who feels his control going slack does the one thing that always tightens it. He reminds the asset that it is small and the world is dangerous and he is the only thing standing between them. He arranges for the boy to be afraid, and then he arranges to be the one who saves him. Gratitude is the leash that never chafes. He is going to make me grateful again. He did not have to wait long to learn the shape of it, because Pelin brought it to him, and the elf's reach had become Harry's greatest unseen advantage. House elves moved through the castle's walls like blood through a body, unremarked, invisible to wizards who never thought to wonder who laid their fires and cleared their plates, and the castle's other elves, who had no love for the silver-bearded wizard that had bound one of their own to silence for 10 years, had begun quietly at Pelin's asking to notice things. They noticed in early February that the headmaster had spent an evening in the third-floor corridor alone at the mirror and come away troubled. They noticed that he had written a letter and burned the draft, and they noticed 3 days before it happened that a particular object had been moved from a locked case in the headmaster's office to a place where a curious first-year, properly nudged, might find it. The object was a music box. Pelin described it in the dark old silver worked with a sleeping enchantment, the kind of thing that played a tune and drew the listener gently down into dreams, harmless in itself, a child's lullaby box. But the elves had seen the headmaster lay a second working over the first, something cold and patient that Pelin could not read, and then they had seen him arrange for the box to be left in an unused music room on the 4th floor, the same floor as Harry's blind spot classroom. On the route, Harry walked twice a week to study with Susan and Neville, with the door ajar and the tune already playing soft into the corridor, where a passing boy could not help but hear it. Harry sat in the warded dark and read the trap hole, and it was, he admitted, beautifully made. A music box that sings a sleeping song into a corridor. I walk, I hear it. I am 11 and curious, and the tune is lovely, so I look in. The box draws me down into an enchanted sleep, deep, frightening, the kind a child cannot wake from alone. And then I am found. He could see the rest of it like a stage set. The boy discovered insensible, the school alarmed, the whisper running, the Potter boy struck down by some dark enchantment, no one knows how, and the headmaster arriving, grave and luminous, to lift the curse no other hand could lift, to draw the famous child back from the dark with a power and a tenderness the whole school would witness and the boy would never forget. I wake in the hospital, wing to his face. The first thing I see, the man who saved me. And every leash he has been losing since September is welded back on in a single night, because now I have felt the dark reach for me and felt his hand pull me out, and a boy who has felt that does not question the hand. He clings to it. It was not even a lie quite. That was the cleverest part, and the part that told Harry most about the man he was fighting. The steward would genuinely save him. The danger would be real, a real enchanted sleep, a real darkness, a real rescue. The steward had simply arranged to be the cause of the danger and the cure for it both, so that the gratitude the cure produced would be real too, honestly earned, unbreakable. He did not manufacture a fake threat and a fake rescue. He manufactured a true one. He was willing to hurt the boy a little, really hurt him, frighten him to the bone, in order to be the one who made it better, because he had decided long ago that a frightened, grateful weapon was a safe weapon, and a little real fear was a small price for a decade more of a leash that never chafed. You would put me to sleep in the dark, Harry thought, looking at the trap, and felt the cold clarity settle over the country like ice, and let me feel the dark take me, and let the whole school watch you pull me back, and you would call it protecting me. You have been protecting me like this my whole life. The cupboard was this. The hunger was this. Every dark you raised me in was a dark you meant to be the only light of. I have never once been afraid of anything that you were not, somewhere upstream, the cause of. He did not let the anger past one breath. He had a trap to turn, and anger made operators clumsy. The crude play would have been to avoid the music room, take another route, never hear the tune, let the trap sit and fail. He discarded it in a second. A trap that simply fails tells the trapper that something is wrong. The steward had arranged for the boy to walk that corridor. If the boy did not walk it or walked it and did not look in, the steward would feel his instrument resisting and would tap the glass harder, and the next trap would be cleverer and Harry might not have 3 days' warning of it. The crude play protected Harry tonight and cost him the war. The second play was to disarm the box quietly and let nothing happen, walk in, diffuse the enchantment with a threat of the country, walk out, the trap dead and silent. He discarded that too, more slowly. A music box that simply stopped working was a clue. The steward had laid a cold patient working over the lullaby. If that working were unwoven, the steward would feel its absence the way he would feel an unwritten ward, and would know that something in the castle had reached into his trap and taken it apart, and there was exactly one new variable that fit. The second play protected Harry tonight and cost him his mask. There was a third play, and Harry found it in the small hours, and it was the kind of move that made the cold-lit place in him go quiet with the pleasure of a clean solution. He would not avoid the trap, he would not disarm it. He would spring it and survive it untouched in a way that looked exactly like luck and let the steward save him from a danger that had already failed, so that the steward came away believing his trap had worked, his leash was welded back on, his instrument was keeping perfect time. He would give the steward the rescue. He would give the whole school the scene. And he would walk out of it with the leash apparently reaffixed and actually cut, with the steward more confident than ever and more wrong than ever, and with one thing more, the thing that mattered most, proof. The elves had watched the headmaster lay the working. Pellin could testify to it in time to the right ears, the House of Law, the ant at the top of the Wisengamot, that Albus Dumbledore had with his own hand enchanted an object to harm a child in his care so that he might be seen to heal him. It was not proof Harry could use yet, but it was proof, and a man building a daylight weapon out of law banks every true thing he can. So Harry decided to be put to sleep in the dark on purpose and to make it look like an accident, and to wake to the steward's face and weep the grateful tears the script required, and to mean none of them. He spent 2 days preparing because a play this fine had no margin. He studied the box's enchantment from a distance, reading its grammar through the walls until he knew its every stroke, the lullaby that drew the listener down, the cold second working that would hold him under, the precise shape of the sleep it meant to impose. And he built, inside the country, a thing he had never tried, a counterfeit. A false sleep he could wear like a mask over the waking country, a stillness so complete that no legilimens and no healer and no steward bending over a hospital bed would find a flicker of the operator beneath it. The boy insensible, breathing, lost in dark dreams, while underneath the dark the country lay clear and cold and wide awake, watching everything through closed eyes. It was the hardest magic he had attempted since the cage at Christmas, and for the same reason, it had to fool the most careful reader in Britain from a distance of inches for as long as the steward chose to look. He practiced it for 2 nights under his father's cloak in the blind spot room, Pellin watching to wake him if the counterfeit slipped into true sleep. By the second night he could hold it. He could lie as if drowned in enchanted dreams and feel a hand pass over his face and hear a grave, kind voice speak his name, and not so much as deepen his breath, the whole performance running on the surface while the country read the room beneath. On the morning of the 3rd day he walked the 4th-floor corridor with Susan and Neville, on the way to the library, exactly on his dull, honest rhythm, exactly when the steward expected, and the lullaby came drifting out of the ajar door of the music room, soft and silver and lovely, and Harry let his step slow and let his head turn and let the boy's curious face do precisely what a curious boy's face does when it hears something beautiful it was told not to seek. "What's that?" he said, and went to the door and looked in, and the trap closed over him exactly as it had been built to. The lullaby reached for him, and Harry let it take the boy while he kept the country. It came up out of the silver box like water rising in a well, the tune folding itself around his senses, soft and total, drawing the listener down toward a dark, warm sleep, and beneath it, the cold second working, patient and clever, ready to close like a lid the moment the listener went under. Harry felt both arrive, and he did the most disciplined thing he had ever done in public. He let the first one have his body and refused the second one his mind. He let his eyes go heavy and his knees go soft, let the boy crumple slowly to the music-room floor with a child's small surprised sigh, let Susan's cry of alarm reach him from the corridor, and as the cold lid came down to seal the sleep, he met it from inside with the counterfeit. He wore the false drowning like a mask. The lid closed on a sleep that looked exactly like the one it had been built to make, and found, beneath the surface it sealed, nothing it could read at all, the country lying clear and cold and wide awake in the dark, watching through the boy's shut eyes. It held. He felt the cold working settle over him, satisfied, certain it had done its work, and he let it be certain. To Susan, kneeling over him with her hands shaking, to Neville, white-faced, bolting for a teacher, to the whole castle that would hear of it within the hour, Harry Potter lay struck down by a dark enchantment on the music-room floor, lost in a sleep no child could wake from. To Harry, lying in the false dark, the room was perfectly clear. Susan's fear, real and kind and useful, Neville's running feet, the box still singing its lovely lethal tune a yard from his ear, and threading toward him through the walls of the castle, fast for an old man, the silver presence of the steward, coming to spring his own trap shut on himself without the faintest idea that the boy beneath him was awake. But the steward was not the first thing to reach him in the dark, and the first thing very nearly ended everything. Harry felt it before he heard the footsteps. The scar gave one hard pulse, the caged fragment behind his eyes straining north on its compass needle, and Harry understood with a cold drop that the door had felt the trap close to. Of course it had. An enchanted sleep laid on the boy who lived in an empty room, with the whole castle's attention not yet arrived. It was the perfect circumstance for the one creature in the castle that wanted, above all things, a private moment with the boy who carried a piece of its master's soul. The cold thing in the turban had its own use for an insensible Potter, and it came now quiet while the corridor was still empty and the teachers not yet summoned, and Harry lay in his false drowning and felt the second predator stoop over him in the dark. A hand touched his forehead, not the stewardess. Cold, dry, two-faced, and the scar erupted, white agony, the caged fragment hurling itself against the wall Harry had built at Christmas, reaching for the thing that bent over him, the broken piece of a soul lunging toward the rest of itself with a hunger that nearly tore the counterfeit apart. The voice that came was not Quirrell's stutter. It was a thin, cold whisper, two voices braided into one, speaking very low and fast. "So this is the boy, asleep. How convenient. Let me look at you. Let me see what the old man has been hiding behind those eyes," and Harry felt it begin to push into his mind. This was the moment the whole year balanced on, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and Harry walked it on a wire over a drop. If the fragment reached the thing in the turban, if the two pieces of the broken soul touched across the wall of his counterfeit sleep, he did not know what would happen and could not afford to learn. If he threw the intruder off with the country's full strength, he would reveal to the second most dangerous reader in the castle that the sleeping boy was a sleeping lie, and the door would know, and the door would tell no one but would act, and act fast, with the boy exposed and the steward not yet arrived. And if he simply held the counterfeit and let the cold thing read him, it would find the country, and that was the same catastrophe by a slower road. He did the only thing that threaded all three, and he did it in the space between 2 heartbeats. He let the intruder in, but he gave it the boy. He had spent 2 days building a false sleep. Now he built beneath it a false mind in the half-second he had. A small, dim, frightened, sleeping child's mind. The mind the steward had spent 10 years trying to make real, shallow and dreaming and empty of anything but a child's green-lit nightmare of a night he could not remember. He pulled the country down and down, below the false sleep, below the false mind, into a stillness so deep it read his absence, and he let the cold thing in the turban push into the shallow, dim room he had built for it and find exactly what it expected to find. A small, powerless boy, asleep, harmless, carrying a piece of the master sealed and dormant behind a child's ordinary dark. He let it see the cage at Christmas, but read as the steward's old seal, dim and dormant, exactly as he had built the cage to read. He let it find the fragment, asleep, reaching, and let it feel the reaching as the only life in the boy, and gave it nothing else, nothing of the operator, nothing of the country, nothing of the 4 months of war. The cold whisper drew back, satisfied and contemptuous. Nothing, a child and a sleeping shard, the old man guards an empty box. The hand lifted from his forehead, the scar's fire banked to an ember, and the door withdrew unhurried, gone back into the corridor and the borrowed body in the stutter before the first teacher's running feet reached the floor, believing now what the steward believed, that Harry Potter was small, that the piece in his scar was sealed and dormant and unreachable, that there was nothing behind the boy's eyes worth the risk of taking him while the castle watched. Harry lay in the dark with the country drawn down to absence and let himself understand what he had just survived. Both of them had read him now. The steward from the high table in the corridors, tapping the glass, the door with a hand on his forehead and a whisper in his sleeping mind, and both of them had come away with the same answer, the answer Harry had spent 4 months building for them to find, small, sealed, harmless, mine to use later. He had stood, insensible, on a music-room floor between the 2 most dangerous beings in Britain, and he had told them both the same lie with his whole self, and they had both believed it, and the cost had been 2 seconds on a wire over a drop that he would feel in his hands for a long time. He let himself feel it once. Then he put it away, because the steward's feet were on the stairs. The teachers came first, McGonagall, sharp with fear, and Snape behind her, black eyes raking the room, and Harry let them find the scene exactly as the script required. The famous child collapsed, the dark box singing, the dreadful tableau. He heard McGonagall's breath catch. He heard Snape go to the box and stop and go very still, and he felt the watcher's attention pass over the silver enchantment and recognize, in the cold second working late above the lullaby, a hand he knew, and Harry in his false dark marked that the watcher knew the steward's work when he saw it and said nothing, and Harry marked the silence and its worth. Then the corridor went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a great presence enters it, and the steward arrived. Harry felt him stoop. Felt the warm, dry old hand settle on his brow where the cold one had been, felt the grave, kind attention bend close, and felt, beneath it, the careful instrument treating of a craftsman checking that his work had landed. Is the boy under? Is the sleep true? Is the trap clean? The steward's mind brushed Harry's the way the doors had, but gentler, a grandfather's touch and a legilimens as both, the same act, never in conflict, and met the false sleep, and the false dim mind beneath it, the small, frightened, sleeping child carrying his sealed and dormant shard, exactly as the steward had built him to be, and exactly as the steward now found him. There, the old man murmured, for the benefit of the teachers and for the boy he believed could not hear him, and there was real tenderness in it, which was the worst thing of all. There now, I have you, you're quite safe, let us bring you back. And the steward lifted the enchantment, drew the lullaby and the cold lid off the boy with a power and a grace that made McGonagall exhale and made even Snape's contempt waver, the great wizard reaching into the dark and drawing the famous child gently back to the light, exactly the scene he had built 3 days to stage. Harry felt the working lift, felt the false sleep's purpose end. And he gave the steward the rest of the script, every line of it perfectly performed. He let his breath catch and deepen, let his eyes flutter and open, let them find the silver beard and the half-moon glasses and the kind grave face bent over him, and let the boy's face fill with the dazed, drowning, helpless gratitude of a child who has been pulled out of the dark by the only hand he trusts in all the world. "Professor," Harry whispered, and let his voice break on it, and let one tear come, because the script called for one tear and Harry could weep on cue now, a skill the cupboard had taught him before the country ever did. I heard music and then I couldn't wake up. He let his hand find the old man's sleeve and grip it, the beaten dog clinging to the warm hand. Thank you. Hush now, said the steward, and his eyes were bright with a satisfaction Harry watched him mistake for tenderness, the satisfaction of a craftsman whose instrument has come back true under his hand. You're safe, my boy, I will always come for you. You need only ever hold on and I will always come. I know you will, Harry thought, behind the streaming face, the country cold and clear and bottomless beneath the weeping boy. That is the whole trap, and you have just sprung it on yourself, and you will walk away from this room more certain of your leash than you have been since September, and the leash is cut, and you saved me from a dark you made, and 3 elves and a bound house servant watched you make it, and I have it all. Thank you, headmaster, truly. You have just taught the whole school that you are the man who saves Harry Potter, and you have given me the first piece of proof that you are the man who endangers him. He let them carry him to the hospital wing, and he wept the right amount, and he clung to the right sleeve, and he was, for the rest of that day, the most grateful boy in Britain, and underneath it the operator banked the day's whole yield and found it good. The hospital wing kept him overnight, and the night gave him his allies fully, for the first time. Susan came back after supper, though visiting hours had closed, talked past the matron with the quiet certainty of a girl raised in a house that knew how rules actually worked, and sat by his bed with her red plates and her round, serious face, and would not be sent away. She had been the one kneeling over him when he fell. The fear was still in her, and under the fear Harry saw something harder had set the specific resolve of a child of a law house who has watched a wrong done and decided, young, that wrongs are things one does something about. It wasn't an accident, Susan said low when the matron had gone. Music boxes don't do that. My aunt deals with cursed objects, confiscations, the improper use office answers to her. That was a curse, Harry. Somebody put it there. Her jaw was set. I'm going to write to her, she should know. Somebody cursed a thing and left it where a first year would find it, and the school's just calling it lucky you were found. Harry looked at her and did the most careful thing he did all day, which was not to seize it. The operator wanted to seize it, wanted to take Susan's letter and aim it like a wand, point the house of law straight at the music box and the hand that made it. But Susan was 11 and honest and offering it freely, and a tool wielded is a tool that learns it was a tool, and Harry had promised himself that the allies he kept would be kept real. So he did not aim her. He let her aim herself and only made sure she aimed true. Would she actually look into it, he asked, the boy's voice uncertain, hopeful. Properly, because everyone here keeps telling me how lucky I am, and I keep thinking somebody had to make that box. It didn't curse itself. He let that land. If your aunt's the sort who'd ask who, then yes, tell her. I'd feel better if someone was asking who. She's exactly that sort, Susan said grimly, and Harry watched the house of bones turn very slightly on its great slow axis, toward a question it would not forget, set in motion not by an operator's lever but by an 11-year-old's honest outrage, which was a thing no legilimens would ever find a fingerprint on, because there were no fingerprints, because Harry had not touched it. He had only told the truth in front of the right person and let the truth do what truth does in the hands of the just. Neville came too, hovering guilty. I ran, he said, miserable. You went down and I just ran from McGonagall. I didn't even. You got help faster than anyone could have, Harry said, and meant it, and let Neville see that he meant it. Susan stayed with me and you got the one person who could do something. That's not running, Neville. That's the two of you doing exactly the right thing between you. He watched the misery go out of the round face and something steadier come into it, and he understood that he had just done for Neville the thing no one had ever done for either of them, told a boy who had been taught he was the failure in every room that he had in fact done well. It cost Harry nothing, and it was true, and the warm walled-off corner of him opened all the way for a moment, and he let it, because these two had sat by his bed when the script said he should have woken alone to the steward's face, and they had rewritten the script without knowing there was one, and a boy fighting a long Cold War needs, now and then, to be reminded that warmth is a real thing and not only a lever. They left when the matron finally prevailed, and Harry lay in the dark hospital wing and banked the day. The leash welded back on in the steward's mind and cut in fact. The door's reading survived, the false mind holding, the second predator gone away contemptuous and wrong, Susan's house turning toward the question, Neville's loyalty set hard, the elves' testimony banked. And one thing more, the thing he had not planned and could not yet measure, which had happened while he lay insensible and which would, he suspected, matter more than all the rest. Susan's letter reached the House of Bones, and the House of Bones answered the way Harry had hoped and not dared to engineer. A week after the music box, an owl came for Susan at breakfast bearing her aunt's reply, and Susan read it with her jaw setting harder by the line, and then carried it to the library table that evening and laid it in front of Harry because she had decided on her own that it was his to see. Madame Bones had written like the law itself, short, exact, and immovable. She had made inquiries. The improper use of magic office had no record of any cursed object reported at Hogwarts, no investigation opened, no incident logged at all. A student had been struck down by a dark enchantment inside the school, and the school had filed nothing, told no one, treated the occurring of it as the end of the matter rather than the beginning. That is not how a safe institution behaves, the aunt had written, in a hand that did not soften for an 11-year-old. That is how an institution behaves when someone has decided a thing should not be looked at. I am writing to the headmaster directly to ask why no report was made. You will tell me at once if anything further occurs. Harry read it twice and kept his face the boy-esque, grateful, a little frightened, glad someone believed him, while underneath the operator weighed the single most useful sentence anyone had handed him all year. She has noticed the silence, not the curse, the cover-up. A house of law looking at the music box had not seen a child's bad luck. It had seen an institution choosing not to investigate a crime against a student, and had asked the one question the steward could least afford. Why was nothing written down? Because the steward had cursed the box himself, and a man does not file a report on his own trap. The very thing that had made the rescue work, the quiet, the discretion, the matter handled in-house, was the thing the House of Law had read as guilt. Dumbledore had built a leash out of a private mercy, and the privacy was now a thread the Wizengamot had taken hold of. She'll actually write to him, Harry asked, the boy's voice, and Susan nodded grimly and said her aunt wrote to people far more frightening than headmasters, and that once Amelia Bones decided a question needed answering, she did not stop asking it until it was. And Harry let himself feel beneath the grateful boy, the cold satisfaction of a piece set exactly where he wanted it and not by his own hand. He had not aimed Susan. He had only stood next to the truth in front of an honest girl from a law clan, and the truth had traveled by itself to the one office in Britain with the standing to make Albus Dumbledore explain himself under his own name. It was a thread, no more, not proof, not yet a case. But it was a thread that ran from a cursed music box straight into the Wizengamot, and the steward could not cut it without revealing he had a reason to, and Harry meant to keep adding threads, one honest daylight thread at a time, until the man who had managed his whole life looked up one day to find himself wrapped in a net made entirely of the truth and unable to say so. Snape had recognized the steward's hand on the box. He turned it over in the dark. The watcher had gone to the music box while Harry lay false drowning, and the watcher had gone still, and Harry had felt the man's attention recognize the cold second working for the steward's craft. Snape knew. The watcher set to guard the boy had just watched the man who set him there curse the boy he was guarding, and Snape was bound to the steward, and bound, Harry now believed, by something to do with Harry's mother, and a man bound to serve where he has just watched a child cursed is a man whose leash has begun, somewhere private, to chafe past bearing. Harry did not know what the watcher would do with the knowledge. But he knew the knowledge was a wedge, driven now between the steward and the one servant whose binding the steward had not made, and that a wedge, once in, only goes deeper. It went deeper that very night in the high tower in a conversation Harry did not hear and reconstructed later from its consequences. Snape went to the headmaster's office. He did not accuse, the watcher accused no one ever. It was not in his nature or his interest. He came instead with a colder thing, the thing a clever, frightened man brings when he has begun to doubt his master and cannot say so. He reported a fact. He had examined the boy in the box, he said, and the boy had recovered with a completeness that troubled him. An enchanted sleep of that depth left residue, confusion, disorientation, hours of grogginess. The Potter boy had woken clear-eyed and clear-voiced within seconds of the curse lifting, wept the right tears, said the right things, and gone under the matron's care steady as a stone. It was, Snape said in his flat, venomous way, not how children recovered from dark enchantments. It was how someone recovered who had never quite been under. And he let that sit in front of the headmaster and watched the headmaster's face and learned nothing, because the headmaster's face was the most disciplined face in Britain and gave Snape only the kindly attention it gave everything. But inside it, Harry was certain, something had finally moved, for the steward could not unhear it. He had built the trap himself. He knew exactly how deep the sleep should have been and how long the residue should have lasted. He had bent over the boy himself and read a true sleep and a dim true mind and been satisfied. And now his own watcher, the most careful reader he had, was telling him that the recovery had been wrong, too clean, too fast, too whole. A craftsman who has felt his instrument keeping a time he cannot account for and tapped the glass and been reassured, and then heard his most trusted hand say the glass is lying to you, that craftsman does not sleep easy. He begins at last to wonder. He made his first approach to the watcher the week after the music box, and he made it through a door the steward did not know existed. He had marked it in October. The way the man's face had moved when it landed on Harry's eyes, his mother's eyes, the grief older and worse than the hate. Whatever bound Severus Snape to Dumbledore's service had been forged in the fire that killed Lily Potter, and it was the one thread the steward held that the steward had not made, had only found and used. And a thread the master only found is a thread the master does not fully control, and Harry had decided, watching Snape go still over a cursed music box, that the time had come to test how much slack was in it. He did not approach the man directly. That would have been suicide. The watcher read children the way Harry read wards, and a first year who sought him out was a first year with something to hide. Instead, Harry did a smaller, stranger thing. In the next potions lesson, brewing his deliberate mediocrity, he let one true competence slip, not the dangerous kind, not the country, but a single quiet, correct instinct, adding his crushed root a half-beat early in a way the textbook did not teach, and only a brewer of real feel would know to do. He did it where only Snape would see. And he let the watcher catch him at it, and then he let the boy's face fill with a flicker of something that was not fear of punishment but something else, a private grief of his own, and he murmured almost to himself low as Snape loomed, "My mother's notes, in the margin of the old book, she wrote you at it early." And he let that land and said no more and bent back over the cauldron. It was a fabrication and a true thing braided together, the only kind of cover Harry trusted now. He had no book of his mother's notes, but he had from Pellin the fact that Lily Potter had been gifted at potions, and he had from his own face in a photograph her eyes, and he had gambled that the name of her gift, spoken low by her son over a cauldron, would reach the one man in the castle for whom your mother was not an abstraction but a wound. He did not look up to watch it work. He felt it work, felt the watcher go rigid above him, felt the black eyes fix on the back of his head with an attention that had nothing of the gauge in it and everything of the grave, felt a man who had spent the year seeing James Potter's arrogant face on the boy suddenly, for one off-balance moment, see Lily's instead. Snape said nothing. He took no points. He swept on to the next cauldron with his robe snapping, and Harry let him go and banked the day's true yield, which was not information but a wedge set in a crack. He had shown the watcher for one breath that the boy he was bound to guard carried the woman he grieved as well as the man he hated, that there was something in Harry worth the binding after all, something of Lily, and not only the despised echo of James. It would not turn the man tonight or this year. But it had begun, and Harry knew from a year of reading him that Severus Snape was a man who, once a crack was set in a thing he believed, could not stop the crack from spreading, and that the next time the steward asked the watcher to do the boy a quiet harm, the watcher would think, for the first time, of green eyes and hesitate. A hesitation was all Harry needed. He had built his whole year out of the spaces other people's certainties left open, and he had just opened one in the most dangerous reader in the castle, using nothing but a dead woman's gift and the truth that he was, after all, her son. Harry felt the wondering arrive over the following week in the change of the steward's attention. The warm corridor pauses stopped, the kindly questions stopped. In their place came something quieter and far more dangerous, a watching that had gone cold at the edges, a grandfather's eyes that rested on the boy a half-second too long now, measuring, no longer certain the clock kept the time he had set it to. The steward had not learned the truth. He had learned only that there was a truth to learn, that the asset he had managed for 11 years was, in some way he could not yet name, not behaving as a managed asset should. And a man like the steward, faced with an instrument he no longer trusted, would do what such men always do. He would test it. He would begin carefully to probe, and the probing would escalate, and somewhere at the end of it the two of them would have to stop circling and face each other across the thing the steward had done. Good, Harry thought, the week after the music box, watching the steward watch him across the great hall with eyes that had lost their certainty. You felt it, finally. You have spent 11 years sure of me, and a cursed music box and a too clean recovery have made you unsure, and an unsure steward is a steward who makes mistakes. I have been waiting all year for you to start doubting, because a man who trusts his leash never checks it, and a man who has begun to doubt it pulls on it, and the first time you pull, I will feel exactly how much slack I have left to work in." He met the old man's measuring look across the hall, and gave it back the boy's face, shy and warm and grateful, the rescued child glad of his protector, and held it just long enough, and looked away just slow enough, that a man who had begun to doubt would find in the boy's face nothing to confirm the doubt and nothing quite to lay it to rest. He fed the steward's uncertainty the only diet that would keep it alive without letting it ripen, a boy who was almost, but never entirely, exactly what he should be. The circling had begun. They both knew it now in their different ways, the steward consciously, troubled, beginning to test, Harry deliberately, patient, beginning to draw the old man out. Two players who had spent a year unaware they were playing each other, now aware, now measuring across a crowded hall, each certain he understood the other, and one of them right. It would end, Harry knew, in a room with a door that locked, the two of them alone with the truth between them. Not yet. There were moves to make first, proof to gather, the door's resurrection to deny. But it was coming, and he found, examining the cold, clear country, that he was no longer afraid of it. He had spent 11 years being managed by this man. He would spend, he thought, considerably less than that ending it. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, Confrontation with Dumbledore. By May the circling had narrowed to a quarter's width, and Harry decided to end it on his own terms before the steward could end it on his. The reasoning was clean. The door was going to move on the stone soon. The country could feel the castle's wards being tested, night after night, a patient pressure working at the third-floor corridor like water at a dam. When the door moved, the endgame would come fast and dark, and Harry did not intend to fight that battle with the steward still believing he held a leash. A man fighting two enemies must not let the more dangerous one keep mistaking him for an ally's pet. The steward, certain Harry was small, would spend Harry without hesitation when the stone night came, throw the boy at the enemy as the script demanded, the noble shield, the destined sacrifice. Harry meant to take that option off the board before the night arrived. He meant to make the steward see him all the way once and then refuse to his face the role the old man had written. It was the most dangerous thing he had planned all year, and he planned it for exactly that reason. Every other move had been about staying hidden. This one was about being seen on purpose in a controlled dose by the one man most able to destroy him if the dose ran wrong. But Harry had learned the shape of the steward across a year, and he believed he understood the single law that governed the man, and the law was this: the steward could not act against Harry without a reason he could fit inside his own conscience. He had spent 11 years calling the cage mercy and the cupboard protection and the planned death a noble sacrifice, because he was not a cruel man and could not bear to be a cruel man, and so every cruelty had to be dressed as a kindness before he could commit it. A steward like that, faced with a boy who saw through the dressing, would not strike, he would explain. He would need, more than he needed the leash itself, to make the boy understand that it had all been for the greater good, because a man who has spent a decade calling his sins virtues cannot survive being told, by his victim to his face, that they were sins. So Harry was going to make him explain. And while the steward explained, he was going to learn the last things he did not know, and give away nothing the steward could use, and walk out having converted the most dangerous piece on the board from a master who held him into an adversary who knew he could not. He chose the ground and the moment. He would not be summoned. A summons was the steward's terms. He went instead, the night after the wards were tested hardest, under his father's cloak, to the stone gargoyle that guarded the headmaster's stair, and he let the cloak fall, and he stood in the open where the corridor's notice charms would mark him, and he spoke the password the elves had brought him weeks before, and he rode the moving stair up to the steward's door and knocked, a first-year boy alone at night where no first-year had any business being, announcing himself. It was a message, and the steward would read it as one. "I know the password to your office. I know it is warded against me, and I came anyway. I am here at the hour of my choosing, not yours." A boy who could not be summoned, arriving uninvited at the seat of the man who had managed his whole life, it told the steward before a word was said that the leash was a fiction, and it dared him to pretend otherwise. "Come in, Harry," said the old man's voice, and there was no surprise in it, which told Harry the steward had felt him coming and chosen not to stop him, which was its own message back: "I am not afraid to let you in." The office was round and high and crowded with the soft whir of silver instruments, a great clawed desk, a sleeping portrait gallery of old headmasters, a red-gold bird drowsing on a perch by the window. Harry took it in at a glance and read the layer beneath it that no student could see, the wards woven into the very stones, old and deep and personal, the working room of a wizard who had defended this office against enemies Harry had never heard of. It was the most heavily warded room he had ever stood in, and he had walked into it alone at night, 11 years old, and he let the steward see that he was not afraid either. The old man sat behind the desk in the lamplight, robes of deep blue, the half-moon glasses catching the flame, and he looked at Harry with the kindly attention that was also the measuring, and the measuring had teeth in it now, the cold edge that had been growing since the music box. "It is rather late for a wander," he said gently, "though I confess I have been expecting a visit, not perhaps by quite so direct a road. Sit, won't you? I think we have a great deal to say to one another, and I would rather we said it sitting down." "I'll stand," Harry said. He said it quietly, and he said it in his own voice, not the boy's, the small grateful boy's, but the one beneath, level and cold and adult, the operator's voice that Snape had glimpsed for half a second in a dungeon corridor, and that no one had heard whole since the Sorting Hat. He let the boy's mask come off, by degrees in the warded lamplight, the only place in the world he had judged it safe to do so, and he watched it land. It landed hard. The steward went still behind the desk. The kindly attention did not break, the man's discipline was too great for that, but something passed behind the half-moon glasses, a recalculation so total Harry could see its edges, the look of a craftsman who has tapped the glass for months and finally, fully, heard it ring false. For 11 years Albus Dumbledore had looked at Harry Potter and seen a clock he was winding. He looked now and saw at last that the clock had been keeping its own time for a year, in his own castle, under his own eye, and that he had not known, and that everything he had built his plans upon was therefore in question. "Ah," the steward said softly, after a long moment, and set down the steepled hands. The gentleness in his voice had changed, not lessened, but deepened, gone grave, the gentleness of a man addressing an equal he had badly underestimated. "There you are. I have wondered these last months whether I was imagining it. I see that I was not." He studied Harry with open eyes now, the pretense of the grandfather laid quietly aside. "How long since the sorting?" Harry said. The hat touched the seal and it broke, backwards. "Everything you locked away came back at once, and the leash you wove through it came apart, and I have spent the year since learning exactly what you did to me, and why, and who helped." He let that stand in the warded air. "I came to tell you that I know, and to hear from you the thing you have spent 11 years preparing to tell me, only you meant to tell it at the end when I was frightened and grateful and ready to die for you. I would rather hear it now, while I am none of those things. So tell me, headmaster, tell me why it was all right." The steward was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke he did not deny a word of it, and that was the most dangerous thing about him, that he would not lie now because he believed the truth was on his side. "Very well," Albus Dumbledore said. "You have earned the truth, and I find I am almost glad to give it, though I had hoped to give it gently and later, and I see now that was one more kindness I had no right to plan." He rose and went to the window where the red-gold bird drowsed and looked out over the dark grounds, and when he spoke again it was the voice of a man laying out, at last, a case he had argued only to himself for 11 years. "The night your parents died, Harry, Voldemort did not die. I knew it within the hour, though it took me longer to understand how. He had done a thing so terrible that the wizarding world has no proper name for it. He had torn his own soul more than once and bound the pieces into objects hidden across Britain, so that while even one remained, he could not truly die. His body was destroyed that night. His soul was not. It fled broken, and it has waited these 11 years for a way back. I have spent those years hunting the pieces of it and destroying what I could find and guarding what I could not." He paused. "And on the night his body was destroyed, one piece of his torn soul did not flee with the rest. It had nowhere to flee to. It tore loose in the moment of his unmaking and lodged in the nearest living thing, which was a child of 15 months, marked across the brow where the curse had struck. It lodged in you." "I know," Harry said. "I have met it. Go on." Something flickered across the old man's face, that the boy had met it, but he went on. "Then you understand the shape of the problem I was handed that night. A piece of the most dangerous soul of the age, sealed in a child I could not destroy without destroying the child. I could have let it lie. I could have raised you in love and warmth and told you the truth and let the peace grow with you, unwatched, unsealed. And one day, when Voldemort returned, as I have never doubted he would, that peace would have been a door in your mind he could open at will, a knife at the throat of everyone you loved, a weakness at the very center of the only person prophesied to stand against him." He turned from the window. "So I sealed it, and to seal it deeply enough to hold, I had to seal more than the fragment. I had to seal you, your magic, your strength, the great wild power you were born with, because that power and the fragment were braided together too tightly to part, and a child of overwhelming strength and a sleeping piece of Voldemort in his head is not a child anyone can keep safe. I made you small so that I could make you safe. I made you weak so that the thing inside you would sleep. And yes, I placed you where you would grow up plain and unknown and out of the world's eye, because a famous, powerful, untrained boy with the Dark Lord's soul in his scar would have been found and used and broken before he was 10, and I could not allow it. And the cupboard," Harry said, "and the hunger, and 11 years with people who hated me, was that also to keep me safe?" The old man's face did not flinch, but his voice gentled into something that was almost grief. "That I did not intend and did not know the worst of, and it is the great failure of my life that I did not look closely enough to see it. I placed you with your mother's blood because her sacrifice left a protection in that blood that no other shelter on earth could match, a ward against Voldemort himself, anchored in your aunt's veins, that has kept you alive through 11 years in which he had servants enough to find a less guarded child in a week. I did not place you there to be starved. I told myself you were cared for. I told myself a great many things, Harry, across these years, because the alternative was to look too closely at the price of what I was doing, and I was afraid that if I looked, I would not be able to bear to keep doing it. And it had to be done. That is the thing I need you to understand above all. It had to be done, or you do not live to 11, and the world does not survive his return. He came back to the desk, and he leaned upon it, and he looked at Harry with the full weight of 150 years and a war Harry had not been alive for. You think I made you a tool. I will not insult you by pretending I did not use you. I have used everyone I have ever loved, Harry, in service of the only thing I have ever truly served, which is the survival of more people than I can count against a darkness that would unmake them all. I used your parents. I used myself. I have spent my whole long life spending the people I love on the altar of the greater good, and I have hated every hour of it, and I have never once stopped, because the arithmetic does not stop being true merely because it is unbearable. One boy weighed against a world, one childhood against the lives of everyone who will die if Voldemort returns to Britain with no one prepared to stand against him. I made that trade. I would make it again. And the cruelest part, the part I will answer for when I am dead, is that I was right to make it, that if you set the suffering of one child against the saving of a world, any honest reckoning comes out where I came out every time, and the only people who say otherwise are people who have never had to hold the lives of thousands in one hand, and the life of a child they have come to love in the other and choose. The office was very quiet, the silver instruments whirred. The old man's eyes were bright, and there was no calculation in them now, only the terrible sincerity of a man who believed, to the floor of his soul, every word he had said, and who was, Harry understood, listening to him, not entirely wrong, which was the whole horror of him. That is the case, Dumbledore said quietly. That is the truth. I would have dressed in gentler clothes had you let me. I sealed you to save you and to save the world that needs you. I hid you to keep you alive. And yes, at the end of it, there is a thing I have not yet said, because it is the hardest thing, and you have come here to make me say the hard things. When Voldemort returns, the piece of his soul in your scar must be destroyed, or he cannot die, and it cannot be destroyed while it lives in you. I have spent 11 years praying I would find another way, and I have not found one, and I may not find one before the end. And if I do not, his voice did not break, but it cost him not to break it, then there will come an hour when I must ask of you the thing I have asked of everyone I ever loved. I will have to ask you to die, Harry, so that he can. And I have dreaded that hour for 11 years, and I raised you as gently as my purpose allowed, precisely so that, when it came, you would be the kind of boy who could meet it bravely and forgive me, and lay down your life for a world that never knew what it cost you. He spread his hands, and old man emptied of his last secret. There, now you know all of it. Tell me I was a monster if you must. I have called myself worse. But before you do, tell me what you would have done in my place with a piece of the Dark Lord in a baby's head and a world to lose. Tell me there was a kinder arithmetic, and show me the working, and I will get on my knees and thank you, because I have looked for it every day for 11 years, and I have never found it. Harry let the silence hold a moment, because the case deserved a moment, and because he wanted the steward to see that he was not answering from anger. It's a good arithmetic, he said at last. I mean that. I have been over it myself this year more times than you'd believe, and most of it is true, and the parts that are true are the reason you've been able to live with yourself. The soul piece is real. The danger is real. Voldemort is coming back, and someone has to be ready, and a piece of him in my head is a knife at the world's throat. All true. And if that were the whole of it, I would be standing here forgiving you, because a man who does a terrible thing for a true reason and hates every hour of it is not a monster, and you are not a monster. He let that land because it was true, and because the steward needed to hear that Harry could tell the difference, so that what came next would not be dismissed as a child's resentment. But it isn't the whole of it, and the part you left out is the part that turns the arithmetic from a tragedy into a fraud. He took one step closer to the desk. You said you sealed the fragment to keep it from being a door he could open. That's the defense. But you didn't only seal it, headmaster. You kept it, fresh, whole, asleep but alive, for 11 years, in a vessel you maintained at exactly the strength required to hold it, and not 1 degree more. A man who wants only to neutralize a piece of the Dark Lord's soul spends 11 years trying to destroy it. You spent 11 years trying to preserve it. You skimmed my parents' vault to fund the search and the war and the order, and you kept a private ledger of it because it was the kind of spending you couldn't explain. And all of it, the whole apparatus, was built around keeping one thing intact and ready, the piece of him in me held in reserve against the day you would need a card to play in a game you intend to control. Harry watched the old man's face and watched it not deny it. You don't mean to destroy the fragment when he returns. You mean to use it to bait him to bargain to spring whatever trap you've been building for a decade, and then at the decisive hour to spend it and me with it, because by then I'll be exactly the grateful, broken, brave boy you raised me to be, and I'll lie down and let you do it. The destruction isn't the tragic last resort, it's the plan. It was always the plan. You didn't raise a boy who might have to die. You raised a sacrifice and you fed it and watered it and kept it small and you scheduled its death before it could walk. Harry, I'm not finished. He did not raise his voice, he lowered it, and the cold in it stopped the old man where a shout would not have. 3 months ago you cursed a music box and left it where you knew I'd find it, so I'd fall into a dark you made, so the whole school could watch you pull me out, so the leash you felt going slack would weld itself back on. You hurt me, really hurt me, frightened me to the bone. That was the design, so that I'd be grateful. That is not the act of a man protecting a child. That is the act of a man maintaining an asset. And you did it in February this year, not in some desperate hour of war, but on an ordinary Tuesday, because you felt your control slipping and you reached for the tool you always reach for: fear. You have kept me on a leash of fear and gratitude my whole life, and every time it loosened you arranged a new dark to save me from. The cupboard, the hunger, the music box, they're the same act, headmaster, repeated for 11 years. You are not the light I was raised to run toward. You are the hand that built every dark I ran from. He let the warded room hold all of it, and then he said the thing he had come to say, the refusal, and he said it not as a plea but as a fact, the way you state a law. So here is what I have decided, and you should understand that it is decided, and that nothing you say tonight will move it. I am not going to die for your plan, not as a martyr, not as a sacrifice, not at the destined hour with a brave, forgiving smile. The role you wrote, the boy who lays down his life so the world can live, I am not going to play it, not because I'm a coward, because it's a lie. You have spent 11 years telling me the only way to save the world is for me to die, and you have spent 11 years making sure I was too weak and too grateful and too small to find another way, and the smallness was the point, because a strong boy looks for the third option, and a weak boy only knows how to suffer beautifully. You did not raise me unable to save the world without dying. You raised me unable to imagine it. That was the cruelest working of all, and it's the one that broke first on the stool, when the seal came down and I found out I had been a country pretending to be a cupboard my whole life. He held the old man's eyes, and there was no triangle of gratitude left in his face now, only the cold, clear adult thing beneath. I am going to find the third option. I am going to learn whether the fragment can be cut from me without killing me, and how, and I am going to do it on my own terms in my own time, and neither you nor Voldemort is going to spend me to do it. The war is real and I will fight it, but I will fight it as a person and not as a card in your hand, and the first move in that fight was walking up here tonight to tell you that the card has learned to read the table. The silence after that was total. The silver instruments had gone quiet, or Harry had stopped hearing them. The old man stood behind his desk, 11 years of certainty cracking visibly across his face, and for the first time since Harry had entered the room, Albus Dumbledore looked not like a steward or a general or a 150-year-old wizard, but like an old man who had built his entire life on an arithmetic and just heard, from the one person with the standing to say it, that the arithmetic had a term in it he had refused to see. You assume, Dumbledore said at last slowly, that there is a third option. There may not be, I have looked. If there is no way to part you from the fragment but death, then your refusal does not save you, Harry. It only means that when the hour comes, you will face it unprepared and alone instead of guided, and the world will lose anyway, and you with it. Maybe, Harry said, but that's my risk to take, and you stole it from me for 11 years, and I'm taking it back. You look for the third option as a man who needed not to find one, because if a third option existed, then everything you did to me was unnecessary and you couldn't bear that, so you search the way a man searches for a thing he's afraid of finding. I'm going to search as someone who needs to find it. We'll see who's the better hunter. He paused. And there's a part of your own arithmetic you've never run, headmaster, because you've never once let yourself believe the variable could take this value. You built me as a strong box to hold a piece of the most powerful dark wizard of the age, and then you broke your own seal. The box is open. The thing you spent 11 years making weak isn't weak anymore. You have been planning this war around a sacrifice. You might want to start planning it around a soldier you don't command. That changes the arithmetic more than my death ever could, and you haven't run it, because you can't yet make yourself believe it's true. There's a thing you have not asked me, Dumbledore said then, and there was a new care in his voice, the care of a man deciding how much of a deeper truth to spend. You have worked out a great deal, the seal, the fragment, the plan, but you have not asked the question that sits beneath all of them. You have not asked why it had to be you, why a piece of him lodged in you and not in some other child, why I was so certain from the first night that you were the one who would have to stand against him in the end. Harry went still because the old man had reached at last for the piece of the board Harry had not been able to see, the thing upstream of the murder, the reason his parents had been hunted in the first place. Then tell me, he said, you've been saving it for the deathbed scene, spend it now. There was a prophecy. Dumbledore said it heavily, as though setting down a stone he had carried a long way. Made before you were born, heard by Voldemort in part, that spoke of a child with the power to defeat him, born as the 7th month died, to parents who had thrice defied him. There were 2 children it might have meant, he chose you. He came to your parents' house and he marked you as his equal with that curse, and in marking you he made the prophecy true and tore a piece of himself into your scar in the doing of it. That is why it had to be you, Harry, not because I chose you. Because he did, and because the moment he chose you, the only future left in the world was one in which you and he must, in the end, face each other, and one of you not survive it. And Harry turned it over in the cold, warded room and saw the shape of the new leash inside the old one, the deepest working of all, the one made not of seals or threads, but of a story. So that's the keystone, he said slowly. Not the seal, the prophecy. You've spent 11 years arranging my whole life around a sentence that says I have to be the one to die killing him, and you've let it do to me what no cage could, because a boy can break out of a cage, but how does a boy break out of a destiny? He looked at the old man with something close to wonder at the completeness of it. You didn't only build me a martyr's death. You found me a prophecy that says the death was always mine, so that when you finally ask me to die, I won't even blame you. I'll blame fate. That's the cleverest thing you've done, headmaster, and you didn't even have to make it up. You just had to make sure I heard it last and frightened and ready to believe a sentence was the same thing as a sentence passed. It is real, Harry, Dumbledore said quietly. Prophecies are not nothing. They're not everything either, Harry said. A prophecy says one of us doesn't survive the other. It doesn't say I have to walk to my death like a lamb on your schedule. It doesn't say I can't find a way to be the one still standing. You read it as a death warrant for me because you needed a death warrant for me, because the whole plan rests on it. I'm going to read it as a thing I get to make true on my terms or break trying. A prophecy that says he and I must end each other says nothing at all about which of us walks away. You've spent 11 years filling in that blank with my name. I'm going to leave it open and live in the blank, and we'll see whose handwriting ends up in it. Dumbledore did not answer at once, and the not answering told Harry everything about what came next. A weaker man would have raged or wept or begged forgiveness. A simpler man would have yielded. You are right, the plan is yours now, I am sorry. But the steward was neither weak nor simple, and Harry watched him do the thing the most dangerous men do when their certainty cracks. He set the crack aside intact to be examined later and reached past it for the next move. The grief on his face was real. It was also, Harry saw, not going to change his behavior by 1 degree, because the grief and the purpose had never once been in conflict in this man, and they were not in conflict now. You have given me a great deal to consider, Dumbledore said, and his voice had gone gentle again, and the gentleness had teeth in it Harry had not heard before, the careful, reasonable, conceding tone of a man buying time. More than I can answer tonight, and I will not insult you with a hasty answer. You are right that I underestimated you. You are right that I have things to reconsider. Perhaps you are even right that there is a third path, and if there is, Harry, I want to find it with you truly, as partners, not as steward and ward. Give me time. Let us speak again when I have thought, and let us see whether the man who failed you might yet be of use to you. The war is coming either way. You will need allies who understand the thing in your scar, and there is no one alive who understands it better than I, and it was beautifully done. The concession, the humility, the open hand, the appeal to need, and Harry recognized it for exactly what it was, because he had spent a year learning this man's grammar, and the grammar of give me time in the mouth of a steward whose control has just failed was not surrender. It was regrouping. He cannot move against me tonight. I have surprised him, and he does not yet know my strength, and a careful man does not strike at an unknown. So he asks for time to learn what I am, to find the lever that still works, to discover whether the seal can be remade on a boy who has outgrown it. He is not offering partnership. He is buying the weeks he needs to find a way to put me back in the box. You want time to work out how to reseal me, Harry said, and watched the old man's eyes and watched the truth of it cross them before the discipline closed over it. Don't, I'll save you the weeks. It can't be done. The seal was keyed to a power that doesn't exist anymore, a small one, and the thing it was built to cage grew past it the night it broke. You could no more reseal me than you could pour a river back behind a broken dam. And if you try, if I feel you reach for so much as the grammar of it, then the careful balance you've kept all year ends that hour in the open in front of the whole school, and the boy who live tells the wizarding world a story about a sealed child in a skimmed vault and a cursed music box, with a house of law already asking the question and a bound house elf ready to swear to it. You've spent 11 years keeping me a secret, headmaster. Reach for the seal again and I stop being one. That's the lever I hold. I'd rather never use it. Don't make me. He let the threat sit clean and exact, and he was careful to make it a threat of exposure and not of power, to brandish the daylight weapon, the law and the proof in the public story, and to keep the country hidden behind it. Let the steward fear the Wisengamot. Let him keep underestimating the thing in the scars box. A man who is worried about a house of law asking questions is a man who is not yet worried enough about the boy in front of him, and Harry intended to keep it that way for as long as the war allowed. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, the cracked certainty and the unbroken purpose warring behind the half-moon glasses, and Harry understood that they had reached, for tonight, the only possible end, not victory, not surrender, but a stalemate held in place by mutual knowledge. The steward knew the boy could destroy his secret. The boy knew the steward could not yet risk striking. Each held the other still. It was the most dangerous kind of peace, the kind that lasts exactly until one side learns something that breaks it, and they both knew that too. It seems, the old man said quietly, that I have a great deal to think about, and that I have been outmaneuvered tonight by an 11-year-old, which has not happened to me in a very long time, and never quite like this. Something moved in his face that might in another man have been the beginning of respect, and might in this one have been only the recalculation of a threat. Go back to your tower, Harry. We are not finished, but we are finished for tonight. One more thing, Harry said at the door, because he had decided to give the old man one true gift before he left, and because the gift was also a blade. Severus Snape watched you curse that music box. He recognized your hand on it. You bound him to guard me, and he watched you endanger me, and whatever oath holds him to you, it didn't hold quietly that night. You've spent a year worrying I'd slip my leash. You might spend the next one wondering about his. And he had the satisfaction, as he stepped onto the moving stair, of seeing the steward go still in a new way, the still of a general who has just been told that a piece he relied upon may have turned, and does not know it for certain, and now cannot stop wondering. Let him wonder, Harry thought, descending. A man dividing his attention between a ward who reads the board and a servant who may have turned is a man who has less of it to spend on the war, and I have just made him spend some of it on the one wedge I want driven deepest. He never reached the tower. He was halfway down the 7th-floor corridor, the confrontation still cooling in him, when the scar went off like a struck nail, white total, the caged fragment hurling itself north and up against the wall he had built, harder than it had ever pulled, and Harry stopped dead in the dark corridor and read what the castle was telling him and felt the whole board tip. The wards on the 3rd-floor corridor were failing. Not being tested now, falling one after another, the patient pressure that had worked at them for weeks finally bursting through, a flock of charmed keys scattering, a transfigured guard unmade, the layered work of half the staff coming apart from the inside in a matter of minutes. The door was moving, tonight. Now in the very hour Harry had spent in the steward's office, the 1 hour the steward's attention had been wholly fixed on the boy in front of him, and wholly turned away from the corridor he was meant to guard. Harry understood, standing in the dark with his scar screaming, that he had been used after all not by the steward but by the door. The cold thing in the turban had felt the wards at their weakest and chosen its night, and the night it chose was the night the headmaster was occupied above the gargoyle with the only thing in the castle more interesting to him than the stone, the boy who had finally slipped his leash. He waited for me to draw the steward's eye, Harry thought, the country flaring cold and vast and ready. Whether he planned it or only seized it, I bought him this hour. The stone is unguarded for the length of one conversation, and the conversation was mine. Far above he felt the steward feel it too, felt the great warded office erupt into motion, the old man already moving, already calling for the staff, but the corridor was on the 3rd floor and the office was on the 7th, and the door had chosen its moment with a year of patience. And Harry, standing between the two, did the arithmetic of distance and time in half a second and knew that he was closer than the steward, closer than any of them, the nearest piece on the board to the thing about to be taken. The door was going for the stone. The enemy was reaching for his resurrection uncontrolled tonight, while the man who meant to control it was 7 floors up and a year too late. And the only thing in the castle near enough to stand between the broken soul and the deathless body it hungered for was a boy both sides believed was small. Harry pulled his father's cloak from inside his robes and drew it over himself and vanished and ran for the stairs. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The seal broken forever. The 3rd-floor corridor stood open when Harry reached it, the great forbidden door hanging wide on a dark that breathed cold up the stairs, and he went through it without slowing, because the time for caution had ended somewhere on the 7th floor, and what came now was a different kind of work. The protections that had taken half the staff to build, the door had spent weeks unmaking, and Harry passed through their wreckage reading each one as he went. A vast 3-headed dog, slumped and snoring over a harp that played itself, Sprout's beast, charmed to sleep, stepped past. A pit of strangling vine gone slack and dead, Sprout again, already burned through. A chamber of charmed keys, most of them fallen and still on the floor, one lock hanging open. A great chessboard, its black war shattered across the stone, crossed in ruin. A chamber where a troll lay felled, not the Halloween troll, a second brought as a guard, dropped by something that had not troubled to be subtle. And a table of potions before a wall of black fire, one bottle already drained. Harry did not solve the riddles or play the games. He had no time and no need. The country read the logic of each chamber at a glance and showed him the cheat under it, and where the door had forced its way by power, Harry followed by power, faster, the black fire parting before a thread of the country like smoke before a wind. He went down through the broken guard of Hogwarts in under 3 minutes, invisible under his father's cloak, the scar a white spike of pain pulling him on, and at the bottom in the last chamber he found the end of the year waiting for him. It was a round stone room, low and cold, empty but for a single tall mirror standing alone at its center, and before the mirror, his back to the door, his turban unwound and cast aside, stood Professor Quirrell. Harry stopped at the threshold in the cloak's silence and read the room, and what he read stopped the breath in him even now, even prepared. The man's head was wrong. The back of his bare skull was not bare, there was a face in it, pressed up out of the bone, white as chalk, with red eyes and slits for nostrils, a face like a snake that had once been a man, and it was awake, and it was alive, and it was the source of the cold pressure that had filled every defense lesson all year, and the scar on Harry's brow howled toward it because the thing in his scar and the thing in that skull were two pieces of the same broken soul, and they knew each other across the room. This was the door. Not Quirrell was only the wood of it. The thing in the back of his head was the master, or the largest walking piece of him, a wraith too weak to hold its own form, riding a living man like a hand in a glove, and it had come to the bottom of Hogwarts to take the one thing that could give it a body that would never die. It was staring into the mirror, and it was furious. "It shows me the stone," the wraith was hissing, in the cold braided voice Harry had heard above his false sleep, and Quirrell's hands shook as they pressed against the glass. "It shows me lifting it, presenting it, drinking, but I cannot reach it. The old fool's last trick. The mirror will not give the stone to one who wants to use it. It gives only to one who would find it and not use it, a riddle, a child's riddle, and I have not the patience left for riddles." The red eyes flared. "Use the boy." Master Quirrell's own voice, thin with terror. "There was a boy," the wraith snarled. "I felt him in the sleeping trap weeks ago, the Potter brat, the shard the old man hides in his skull. Bring him. A child who does not understand what the stone is, who wants only to escape this room. He will look in the mirror, and the mirror will give it to him, and I will take it from his hand. Find the boy." Find him, and Harry, standing invisible at the threshold, understood that he had perhaps 4 seconds before the endgame chose its own shape, and that he had a choice to make, that he had been circling all year and could circle no longer. He could leave. The cold operator's voice laid it out in half a heartbeat. Turn, go, let the wraith fail at the mirror, let the steward arrive and spring whatever trap a decade had built, let the two masters fight their war over the stone while the small boy stayed small and safe and unseen. It was the careful play. It was the play he had made all year. He could not make it, not because of courage, though he had that, because of arithmetic. If the wraith failed and fled tonight, it would come back and back for years, hunting the stone and the pieces of itself, and one of those pieces was in Harry's skull, and there would never be a night the enemy did not want it. And if the steward arrived and won, the steward would take the stone and the wraith both into his patient decade-long plan, and the plan ended in Harry's scheduled death. Both roads ran through him. There was no version where he walked away tonight and was free of it later. The only road to his own life ran straight through this cold stone room tonight, while the enemy was weak and bodiless and reaching before either master was ready. So Harry did the thing that ended the long game of hiding and began whatever came after. He let the cloak fall from his shoulders, and he stepped into the chamber in the open, 11 years old, and he let them both see him. "You don't need to find the boy," he said, and his voice did not shake. "He's here." Quirrell whirled. The wraith's red eyes found him across the cold room, and the scar screamed, and the two pieces of the broken soul stared at each other through the boy who carried one of them, and for the first time in 11 years, the thing that had killed Harry's parents looked at what it had made of their son, and did not yet understand that it was looking at its own death. Harry Potter, the wraith breathed, and Quirrell's ruined head tilted, the red eyes drinking him in. "Come to me then, come and look in the glass." Such a helpful boy, such a brave, foolish, helpful boy. Yes, the old man raised you well, didn't he? Raised you to run toward danger, to want to save the day. Look in the mirror, Harry, tell me what you see. Do that one small thing, and I will let you live. It was a lie, and it was clumsy, and that told Harry the most important thing of the night. The enemy was weak. The wraith that had once needed no tricks was reduced to bargaining with a child, because it had no body and no wand of its own, and only a terrified host between it and oblivion, and it was reaching for the stone with the desperation of a drowning thing. He is at the lowest ebb he will ever be at, Harry thought, the country going cold and clear and vast behind his calm. No body, no army, a borrowed glove of a man and a mirror he cannot solve. If I am ever going to face him on terms I choose, it is now, tonight, in this room, before he is anything more than this. "I'll look," Harry said, and walked toward the mirror, and let them both believe the boy had taken the bait, because he needed to be close, and because he wanted, before the end, to see the thing the steward had hidden behind every protection in the castle. He stood before the glass, and the wraith hissed at Quirrell to hold him, and Quirrell's cold hands closed on Harry's shoulders, and the scar went to white fire under the touch, and Harry looked into the mirror of Arist, and the mirror showed him what he most desired in all the world. It did not show him the stone. He had expected that. The operator had already reasoned that the stone went to one who wanted it without wanting to use it, and Harry did not want the stone at all, so the mirror had no stone to give him. He had expected, perhaps, to see his parents. The longing for them was real, buried under a year of cold work, and a mirror of desire might have found it. It showed him neither. It showed him a boy standing free. It showed him himself, grown, unbent, the country lit and open in his. No leash and no seal and no passenger pulling at his scar, standing in a world where two old men's plans had no claim on him, where he had chosen his own path and walked it, where the thing in his head was a thing he held and not a thing that held him. And beside the grown, free boy in the glass stood a few small figures, a round-faced friend, a red-plated girl, a small, bright-eyed elf. The handful of real things he had kept through a year of necessary cold. The mirror showed him not power and not vengeance and not even his parents, but authorship, a life that was his own, with the few he had chosen to love still in it. And Harry looked at it and understood himself a little better than he had a minute before, and felt the desire so cleanly and wanted nothing from the glass except to make it true, and the stone dropped into his pocket. He felt it arrive, a small heavy weight, warm against his hip, blood-red through the cloth of his robe, and he understood the riddle's answer in the instant it solved itself. The mirror gave the stone to one who desired to find it and not to use it, and Harry, who wanted only his own free life and had no use for gold or deathlessness, had wanted in that moment only to keep the stone away from the thing that would use it, to find it so the enemy could not. The mirror had read him true. It had given the stone to the one person in the room who did not want its power, and that person was the boy the wraith had brought to the glass to steal it. "Well," the wraith hissed, the red eyes burning, "what do you see?" And here was the hinge of the whole night, the half-second the year had been built toward, and Harry stood with the stone warm against his hip and the enemy's hands on his shoulders and made the choice he had walked into this room to make. He could lie, say he saw nothing, stall, run. But the wraith would feel the stone, a piece of a soul that had torn itself apart to chase deathlessness would feel an object of deathlessness a foot away, and the lie would buy seconds and cost surprise. So Harry did not lie, he told the truth, and the truth was a weapon, and he had been sharpening it all year without knowing it. "I see myself free of you," Harry said, "both of you, and I have the stone in my pocket, and you're never going to touch it." The wraith screamed, Quirrell's hands clamped down, burning, the cold pressure in the room spiking to a roar, and the red eyes blazed and the borrowed mouth shrieked, "Kill him, take it," and Quirrell lunged to seize the boy in the pocket and the stone all at once. And Harry Potter, who had spent a year being small, stopped being small. He opened the throttle. Not all the way he had learned in the empty classroom in October that the country had no floor, and a boy does not pour an ocean into a stone room he is standing in. He opened it the way he had practiced opening it for control, but in reverse, not throttling down to a trickle but up, past the feather, past the trunk, past anything he had let himself reach with witnesses in the world, up into the lit terraces of himself, vault on burning vault, until the cold stone chamber filled with a pressure that had no wand and no word behind it, only a boy who had finally decided to be seen. The torches guttered and went blue. Frost bloomed across the mirror of Ariston ferns and then cracked it corner to corner with a sound like a shot. The stone burned warm against his hip, and the country came up through Harry in a slow rising tide of light no eye in the room could see and every nerve in the room could feel, and Quirrell, lunging, ran into it like a man running into the sea. The hands that seized Harry's shoulders blistered. Quirrell screamed a human scream, the wood of him, not the wraith, and snatched back, fingers gone red and cracking, and stared at them in horror, and Harry understood the old protection even as it worked. His mother's death had laid something in his skin that the enemy's borrowed flesh could not bear to touch, a love made into a ward, 11 years old and still burning. But it was not his mother's ward that filled the chamber now. It was the country, the whole returned ocean of him, and where the mother's ward only burned what touched the boy, the country reached. Harry raised one hand, not for a spell. He had no need of spells, the gesture was only to give the room something to look at, and he took hold of the cold pressure that was the wraith, the way he took hold of the passenger every night, the same will that caged the shard behind his eyes now closing around the larger broken thing across the room, and he pressed. The wraith shrieked. It felt for the first time that the small boy was not small, that the shard it had come to harvest was held inside a vessel that had grown into something the master of death had no measure for, and it tried to do the thing it had done to 100 enemies, tried to pour itself out of Quirrell's burning skull and into the boy, to seize the body and the shard and the stone all at once, the possession that had always been its surest weapon. It flung itself out of its host in a streamer of black cold and drove for Harry's eyes, for the scar, for the piece of itself it could feel waiting there. And Harry let it come to the threshold of the oldest room of him and slammed the door. The wraith struck the cage Harry had built at Christmas, the watch house written in Harry's own hand around the dreaming shard, and it could not get in. The shard reached for it from inside, hungry, the two pieces straining toward each other across the wall, and the wall held because it was not the steward's broken seal but Harry's living one, keyed to nothing the enemy could call to, holding by a will that did not sleep and did not yield. The wraith clawed at it, a piece of a soul trying to rejoin a piece of a soul, the most natural pull in the broken thing's nature, and met a boy who had spent a year deciding that the fragment behind his eyes was his to hold and no one else's to claim, and the boy's decision was stronger than the enemy's hunger because the boy was whole and the enemy was only pieces. "No," Harry said in the cold and the blue light and the screaming, and it was the truest word he had ever spoken. it's mine. You broke it off and you put it in me, and you do not get it back, not tonight, not ever. It is the one piece of you that will never answer your call again, because it answers to me now, and I am not letting go. He turned the country on the wraith then, not to claim it. He could not destroy a soul piece barehanded, and would not have known how, but to deny it the one thing it had come for, a body. He severed it from Quirrell. He took the black, cold streamer of the wraith and the burning ruin of the host, and he pried them apart with a thread of the country, peeling the parasite from the dying man, and Quirrell, freed, used up, his flesh failing where the boy's ward had burned it, crumpled to the stone, emptied, the wood of the Dark Lord's glove discarded at last. The wraith, torn loose, bodiless, screamed its rage into the freezing chamber, a thing of smoke and red light with nowhere to go and no flesh to hold it. For one moment before he threw it, Harry held the wraith close in the fist of the country, and used the closeness to learn the one thing he could not learn any other way. He had been studying the fragment behind his eyes for half a year, but a single shard tells you little about the whole. It was like trying to read a book from one torn page. Now he had the largest walking piece of the same broken soul caught in his hand, raging, and Harry, cold, clinical, an operator even here, reached into the contact the way he had reached into the oldest room of himself at Christmas, and read it. He read the texture of a soul that had torn itself apart and the seams where the tearing had been done. He read the desperate architecture of the survival, the way the pieces had been bound into objects and scattered, the long road around death the boy in the gray dormitory had built. And he read in the wraith's own furious knowledge, the number, not all of it. The wraith guarded that even in its rage, but enough to know that the shard in his scar was one of several, that the enemy was hidden in the world in more places than this, and that throwing this piece into the forest would no more kill him than tearing one page kills a book. It was the worst news he could have learned, and he was glad to have learned it, because a war you understand is a war you can win, and a war you do not is a war that wins you. There are more of him, Harry thought, holding the screaming wraith, hidden things scattered, each one a tether holding him to the world. He cannot truly die while one remains, and the one in my scar is the only one he will never be able to hide again, because I have it, and I am not a buried cup or a forgotten ring. I am awake. As long as I hold this shard, I am the one piece of his immortality that can see him coming. It changed the shape of the years ahead entirely. He had thought tonight might be an ending. It was a map of a hunt that would take him years and lead him to every place the enemy had hidden a piece of himself, with the shard in his own head as the compass that would always point the way. Then the wraith tried in its last desperation, the thing Harry had been waiting for it to try. It stopped clawing at the cage and tried instead to bargain with the shard inside it, to call to its own buried piece. Master, to fragment, come to me, rejoin me, we are one. And Harry felt the shard behind his eyes stir to the call, felt the oldest pull in the broken thing's nature wake, the piece yearning toward the whole. And Harry met it not with the wall, but with a thing he had not known he could do until the moment demanded it. He spoke to the shard himself, master to fragment, in the cold, clear voice that had run him all year. No, you don't answer to him any more. He broke you off and abandoned you in a baby's skull for 11 years and never once came back for you. I'm the one who learned your name. I'm the one who built you a wall instead of a cell. You're not his lost piece. You're mine now, and a thing that is mine does not go when he calls. And the shard, which had been the enemy's for a decade and Harry's for half a year, hesitated at the threshold of its master's call and stayed. It stayed inside Harry's wall, inside Harry's keeping, and did not go, and the wraith felt its own soul piece refuse it, and the scream it made then was not rage. It was something Harry had never expected to hear from the thing that killed his parents. It was grief. You cannot, it shrieked. I am immortal, I made myself immortal. You are a child, you made yourself pieces, Harry said. That's not the same thing. And he reached out with the country one last time and did not kill it, because it could not be killed this way, and he knew it. But he threw it, gathered the bodiless wraith in a fist of light and flung it out and away, out of the chamber, out of the castle, out past the broken corridor and the failing wards into the night and the dark forest beyond. A piece of a soul cast back into the long homeless waiting it had crawled out of, denied its body, denied its stone, denied the shard it had come to reclaim. Sent back to nothing to begin its hunting again from the bottom. It would return. Harry knew that, standing in the wreck of the chamber with the frost cracking off the broken mirror. A thing in pieces does not die because you throw one piece into the dark. It would gather itself and find new flesh and come again in a year or 5 for the stone it had lost and the shard it had failed to take and the boy who had denied it both. The war was not over. It had, if anything, only properly begun. But it would not come back tonight, and it would not come back to a controlled trap sprung shut by a steward holding all the cards, and it would not come back to a small grateful boy who could be spent. It would come back someday to this, to the thing in the cold chamber that had taken its body and its stone and its shard, and thrown the master of death into the forest like a stone across water. And Harry intended, between now and then, to become something even that could not measure. He stood among the blue guttering torches, the stone warm at his hip, Quirrell still and empty on the floor, the broken mirror weeping frost, and he let the throttle close, slow. the ocean draining back down through the burning terraces into the riverbed he had spent a year teaching it, until the chamber was only a cold stone room again, and the boy in the center of it was only, to any eye that might come, a small first year standing where a battle had been. Then he took the stone out of his pocket and held it up to the failing torchlight, blood-red and deathless in his palm, and considered, for one cold, clear moment, what to do with the most coveted object in Britain, while 7 floors of running footsteps came down toward him through the broken dark. The footsteps were the stewardess, and Harry had until they arrived to do the one thing that would deny both masters at once, and he did it without hesitation, because he had decided the answer weeks ago, in the cold under his father's cloak, the night he first understood there were 2 resurrections and not one. The stone could not be kept. If Harry kept it, it became the most dangerous thing he owned, a beacon the Wraith would hunt forever, a temptation the steward would maneuver to control, a deathless prize that would warp every choice Harry made for the rest of his life. And it could not be handed to the steward, because the steward's whole patient decade-long plan needed exactly this, an object of deathlessness in his keeping to bait and bind and finally trap the enemy's return on his own terms, with the Boreliquary spent at the decisive hour. The stone in the steward's hand was the return plan completed. The stone in the Wraith's hand was the resurrection uncontrolled. The stone in Harry's hand was a target painted on his own back. There was only one place the stone was safe from all of them, and that was nowhere. Harry closed his hand around it and reached into the country and found, the way he had found fiendfire and basilisk venom in the oldest vaults, the unmakings that destroyed past repair, the grammar of ending. He did not have Flamel's leave and did not need it. The stone was 600 years of one man's work, and Harry was 11, and the country had no floor. He poured a thread of it into the blood-red heart of the thing, not to use it, not to wish on it, but to unmake it, to find the long, patient enchantment that held immortality in a stone and simply cleanly end it. The stone grew warm, then hot, then white, and then it crumbled in his palm to a fine red dust that ran out between his fingers and was gone, drifting down through the blue torchlight to settle on the cold floor, 6 centuries of deathlessness undone in the time it took to draw a breath. He opened his empty hand and felt the rightness of it settle in him like the last piece of a year-long working, clicking home. Neither master would have the stone. There would be no controlled resurrection and no uncontrolled one, not by this road, not this year. The Wraith would have to find another way back, the long way, the hard way, and the steward would have to build his war around a boy who had just dismantled the keystone of his patient plan and would dismantle every other keystone he could reach. The board was swept of the one piece both of them had been reaching for, and the boy who swept it had done it not for power, but to keep his own life out of their hands. The steward arrived as the last of the dust settled. He came through the broken chambers like a storm contained, robes of deep blue, wand in hand, a century and a half of war in his stride, and he stopped at the threshold of the cold round room and took it in at a single sweeping glance. The cracked and weeping mirror, the blue guttering torches, the emptied husk of coral on the stone, the faint red dust drifting on the floor, and the small boy standing alive and untouched in the center of it all, his hand open and empty. And Harry watched the most disciplined face in Britain do the arithmetic of the scene, watched it find the husk and the dust and the living boy and reach the only conclusion the evidence allowed, and watched 11 years of certainty finish breaking behind the half-moon glasses. The stone, Dumbledore said quietly. It was not quite a question. Gone, Harry said. I unmade it. Neither of you gets it. Not him. He's in the forest. You'll have felt him go. And not you. He let the old man hear it plainly. I know what you needed it for, a deathless thing in your keeping to bait him back on your terms, with me as the card you spend at the end. I told you in your office I wasn't going to play that role. This is what that looks like. The plan needed the stone, and the stone is dust, and the plan is over. You're going to have to fight this war the honest way now, without a controlled resurrection, without a reliquary you can spend, without a stone in your pocket. The same way the rest of us have to fight everything. Without a guarantee. The old man looked at the dust and at the husk and at the boy for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone very quiet, and there was something in it Harry had not heard from him before, not the grandfather, not the steward, not the general, something closer to awe and closer still to fear. You destroyed Nicholas Flamel's life's work, Dumbledore said, drove off Voldemort barehanded, severed him from his host, and held the shard in your scar against his claim at 11, without a wand, in the time it took me to descend 7 floors. He studied Harry as though seeing him for the very first time, which Harry supposed he was. I built you to be a strong box. I have spent the evening discovering that I built something I do not understand and that I cannot control, and that I have spent 11 years teaching to despise me. That is a combination of errors I would have called impossible in anyone this morning. You didn't build this, Harry said. You built a cage. I'm what was inside it. You only ever saw the cage, so you thought the cage was me. That was your whole mistake from the night you walked into my parents' study and decided a baby was a thing you could manage. You never once looked at what you were actually managing. If you had, you'd have been afraid of me years ago, and you'd have been right to be. He let that stand in the cold chamber, and then he set down the terms, because a stalemate has to be named to hold, and he wanted it named. Here S where we are, headmaster. You can't reseal me, you saw why tonight. You can't spend me, I've taken the stone that made the plan work, and I'll take anything else you build toward my death the same way. And you can't expose me, because the things I know about you would end you before they ended me. The seal, the skimmed vault, the cursed music box, a house of law already asking questions, and an elf ready to swear. So you're not my steward anymore. You're not my enemy either, the war's real, and we both want the same monster dead, and I'm not fool enough to fight you and him at once. You're something you've never been to anyone, I think, in a very long time. You're a man I'll work with exactly as far as I trust you, and not one step further, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing I'm watching the table as closely as you are. He paused. That's the deal. It's the only one on offer, and it's a great deal better than you gave me. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time in the cold chamber among the wreckage of his 11-year plan. And when he answered, he did the thing Harry had not been certain he would do, the thing that told Harry the old man might, after all, be worth the narrow trust the deal allowed. He accepted it. You are right that I never looked, Dumbledore said slowly. It is the truest thing anyone has said to me in many years, and it will take me longer than I have left to reckon with all of what it cost. I told myself I was protecting a child, and I built a cage, and I called the cage the child, and I have just watched the child step out of it and undo in an evening what I spent a lifetime preparing. He inclined his head, and there was no calculation in it now that Harry could read, only an old man's exhausted honesty. I will not pretend I can become overnight someone who deserves even the narrow trust you offer, but I will take the offer, Harry, and I will earn what of it I can. The war is real, as you say. The monster is real and loose and weaker tonight than he will ever be again, and you have made him so. If you will let me, I would rather spend my remaining years helping you find the third path than spend them mourning the boy I meant to spend. There may be a way to part you from the shard that does not require your death. I stopped looking once because I needed not to find it. I will look again as a man who needs to. We may be the better hunters together. We'll see, Harry said. Start by giving me back my parents' vault and the grey ledger and the truth in writing about the night you came to the manor. Earn it in daylight where I can check the working. Then we'll talk about hunting. And the old man inclined his head again, accepting even that, and Harry understood that he had won not the war, which was years and lifetimes from one, but the only victory that mattered tonight. He had walked into the bottom of Hogwarts as an asset two masters meant to spend, and he was walking out as a person neither of them owned. He left the steward among the ruins to deal with the husk and the dust and the long explanations a broken corridor would require, and he climbed back up through the wreckage of the castle's guard, and somewhere on the stairs the cold operator that had run him for a year quieted, and the boy came back up, tired in the deep way the country went tired, 11 years old and having unmade a stone and thrown a dark lord into a forest, and wanting, more than anything, the few small, true things he had kept. He found them in the empty common room, waiting up, because that was the kind of friends he had chosen. Susan had refused to go to bed. She had heard the alarms, felt the castle shudder, known somehow that it had to do with him. Neville sat white-faced beside her, and had stayed not because he was brave, he would have said, but because Harry was his friend and his friend was somewhere in a shaking castle, and you did not go to bed while that was true. And when Harry came through the portrait hole, alive, unmarked, they both came up off the couch at once, and the relief in their faces was a real thing, an unmanaged thing, the warmest thing he had seen all year. He stood in the firelight and looked at the two of them, and he made the last decision of the night, and it was not an operator's decision at all. He told them the truth. Not all of it, not the country, not yet, not the full size of what lived in him. That was a weight he would not hand to two 11-year-olds, and a danger he would not yet risk. But the shape of it, that the man everyone trusted had done him a great wrong long ago, that he had spent the year quietly learning it, that something dark had come hunting in the castle tonight and he had stood in its way and it had fled, and that he was not, and had never quite been, the ordinary boy he had let them think he was. He told them because they had sat by his bed and waited up by his fire, because the year had taught him that warmth was a real thing and not only a lever, and because a person who fights a long war with no one who knows him fights it as a thing and not as a man, and Harry had decided on a stool under a hat that whatever else he became, he would not let them make him into a thing. Susan listened with her jaw set and her aunt's name already forming, the house of law turning toward a wrong it would not forget. Neville listened with his round face going from fear to something steadier and fiercer, the courage that had always been in him finding at last a thing worth spending itself on, and neither of them ran or recoiled or asked to be let out of it. They moved closer the way the chosen few do, and Susan said, "Then you're not fighting it alone," and Neville said, "No, just that," and meant it with his whole heart, and Harry felt the warm walled-off corner of him open all the way and stay open, because he had built it shut to survive, and he did not have to survive alone anymore. Later, when they had finally gone up, Harry stood alone at the dark window of the tower and breathed his elf's name into the quiet, and Pelin came and stood beside him, and the two of them looked out together over the grounds toward the black line of the forest where a piece of a soul had crawled away to wait. "It is done, young master?" Pelin asked. "It started," Harry said. "That's different, but yes, the seal's broken forever, there's no putting me back. The stone's gone, he's gone for now. And the man who built my cage knows he can't hold me." He was quiet a moment. "And we have a vault to recover, and a manor to wake, and a war coming, and a piece of the enemy in my head I still have to learn how to cut loose without dying. So no, it's not done, but it's mine now, all of it, the whole board, mine to play." Far down in the oldest room of the country, the fragment dreamed its greenlit dream behind the wall Harry had built, caged and watched and known, and its compass needle swung slow out past the window, out to the dark forest where the rest of the broken soul had fled, and held there pointing the way it always would. A thing Harry no longer feared, because he had stopped letting it be a leash and made it a compass instead, so that as long as the enemy lived, the boy would always know exactly where to find him. The country stretched away inside him, lit and vast and bottomless, terrace on burning terrace climbing up into a dark that had no ceiling, the whole great inheritance that had flooded back on a stool one autumn night and never once drained away. For 11 years, a careful man had kept it locked behind a wall and called the locking love. It would never be locked again. Whatever Harry Potter became now, and he meant to become a great deal, he would become it awake and free and his own, with the lights on, where no one could wind him. Outside, the first gray of morning came up over the forest. Harry watched it come, the small elf warm and faithful at his side, the sleeping castle quiet around him, the broken year behind him and the chosen path ahead, and for the first time in his life, the boy who had been built to stay small stood at the top of the world he had been kept out of, and was not afraid of any of it. Chapter 7 End.